cabin was small, worn out by time, tucked away on the edge of a forest that felt endless. I had always wanted to get away from the noise and busyness of city life, so when I found this place for rent, I didn't hesitate. It seemed perfect, a secluded spot, far from anyone, just me and nature. No distractions, no interruptions, just a weekend alone to clear my mind. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange hue across the landscape. The air was thick with the smell of pine and fresh earth, a welcome change from the staleness of city life. I pulled my car up the dirt road, which was barely wide enough to drive through, and parked next to the cabin. The cabin looked exactly as the pictures had shown, old but sturdy. The wooden walls were faded and chipped in places, but it had character. A front porch with a single rocking chair faced out into the woods, where the trees stood tall and intimidating in the fading light. I unloaded my bags and carried them inside. The interior was just as rustic as the outside. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of old wood filled the air. A small stone fireplace sat against one wall, with a pile of dry logs stacked neatly next to it. The furniture was sparse. An old couch, a couple of chairs, and a wooden table with a few mismatched chairs around it. The kitchen was basic, just a small stove, a fridge, and a sink. Everything looked functional, but nothing was modern. It was clear that this place had been left alone for a while. After I unpacked, I set up a fire in the hearth. As the flames crackled, I sat down on the couch, staring into the fire. The heat felt good against the chill of the night, and the crackling sound was soothing. The sky outside had darkened, and the stars began to appear in the clear, unpolluted sky. It was peaceful, but as I sat there, something felt off. A small chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the woods themselves were watching me, waiting. The wind outside picked up, causing the trees to sway and groan. It sounded like whispering, a soft, constant rustle that didn't quite make sense. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would rid me of the strange feeling. The bed was just a simple frame with a thin mattress, but it was enough. I pulled the covers up and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The night outside was so quiet that every little noise seemed amplified. The creaking of the house, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something. A faint thud came from outside, but it was strange. Too loud to be an animal, and too deliberate to be the wind. I held my breath, waiting. The thud came again, closer this time. My heart started to race. There was no one around for miles, at least no one I knew. I had rented the cabin alone, and no one was supposed to be here. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The thuds continued, rhythmic, like someone or something was pacing just outside. My mind raced. Maybe it was an animal, but then why did it sound like footsteps? My instincts told me to stay quiet, to remain still and listen. Maybe it would go away, but it didn't. It kept getting closer, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on the leaves. It was unnerving. I quietly got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I grabbed a flashlight from the table next to the bed, shining it toward the window. I could barely make out shapes in the dark, trees, bushes, but nothing moved. The footsteps stopped. Everything went silent. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, holding my breath. Then the thuds came again, only now they were coming from the porch. I could hear the distinct sound of something heavy thumping against the wooden floorboards. My pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was sure there was someone out there. The question was, who? I quickly moved toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, but I had to know. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost or someone passing through, but I had to check. I opened the door slowly, just enough to peek outside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The porch was empty. No one was there. My heart was still racing, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The air was cold now, much colder than before. The woods around me felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It felt as if I were intruding, like I didn't belong here. I stood there for a while, listening. The wind had picked up again, rustling the branches above. I could hear the faint sound of animals moving in the distance, but nothing unusual. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. A loud thud, followed by a scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. I froze. The noise was coming from behind the cabin now. My mind raced. There was no way it could be an animal. This was something else, something deliberate. I moved slowly around to the back of the cabin, keeping my flashlight low. The light flickered as I walked, casting long, eerie shadows. The ground was uneven, with roots and rocks that tripped me up as I moved. I was starting to panic, the rational part of my brain telling me to stay calm. But it was hard. I had no idea what was out there, and the silence around me felt oppressive. As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I nearly stepped on something. It was a small, crude wooden stake, stuck into the ground. My flashlight caught the edge of it, and I bent down to examine it. It wasn't just a stick. It was something that had been driven into the earth, as if someone had made a mark or left a message. I picked it up carefully, holding it in my hand. It felt ancient, worn, like it had been there for a long time. My mind raced with possibilities. Who would leave something like this? What did it mean? Before I could think further, the sound of footsteps returned. This time, it was clear. Someone was moving toward me. The steps were slow but steady, and they were getting closer. I quickly turned off my flashlight, crouching low against the cabin's wall, my heart thumping in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I held my breath. Whoever it was, they were coming straight toward me. The air felt thick, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. Complete silence. I waited, trying to steady my breath. My fingers were cold, clutching the wooden stake, but I didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to peek around the corner. The path behind me was empty. Confused and terrified, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't trust the woods, not with the strange noises, the unsettling feeling, and the odd wooden stake. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. I grabbed my things in a rush, not bothering to tidy up. I was out of there, fast. The drive back down the dirt road felt longer than it should have. Every twist and turn in the road, every bump, made my heart race. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I still don't know what was out there in the woods or who or what was watching me that night. All I know is that I'm never staying in another cabin, alone, in the woods again. I never thought I'd end up spending the night at a cabin all alone. It wasn't even supposed to be like this. The whole trip had started as a quick getaway with some friends. But things went south when one of them backed out last minute. Then another one got caught up with work, and finally, it was just me. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. Willow Ridge Cabin was located deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, with no cell service, no distractions. I thought it would be a perfect place to clear my mind. The drive out there had been longer than expected, especially since I had to navigate winding back roads that seemed to go on forever. The sun had been setting by the time I finally pulled up to the cabin. The sky painted with streaks of orange and pink as I parked beside the old wooden structure. The cabin was quaint, tucked into the trees, surrounded by thick forest. It looked like something out of a postcard, rustic and charming, a perfect little hideaway. I got out of the car and stretched, taking in the cool, crisp air. The place was eerily quiet, too quiet. Not even the usual sounds of birds or animals seemed to fill the space. The silence was almost oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was an unsettling feeling, but I chalked it up to nerves about being alone. Inside the cabin was just as charming, albeit a little musty from being empty for so long. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a cozy living room with mismatched furniture. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved around, unpacking my things. I felt a slight unease in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it down. I figured it was just the isolation getting to me. As I went about setting up for the night, the weather started to change. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in fast, blocking out the last of the daylight. The wind picked up too, howling through the trees, making the cabin shake slightly. It was the kind of wind that could make you feel small, like the world was pressing down on you. I decided to make a fire, hoping it would help with the growing sense of discomfort I felt. As I went outside to gather some firewood, the wind was stronger now, and the trees creaked under its force. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The branches moved, but there was something strange about how they swayed. It felt deliberate, almost as if they were watching me. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. Back inside, I started the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound filling the cabin. The light from the flames danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. I sat down by the fire, hoping to relax, but the strange feeling lingered. It was like being watched, but when I looked around, I saw nothing, just the flickering shadows and the stillness of the cabin. I tried to shake it off and read for a while, but it wasn't long before the storm outside grew worse. The wind howled louder, and the rain began to beat against the windows with such force that it sounded like a drum. The power flickered a few times before going out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, but I reminded myself that this was a normal part of being out in the wilderness. Power outages happened all the time in remote areas. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to calm my nerves. The only sound now was the relentless storm and the occasional crack of thunder. I decided to go to bed, figuring I'd get some rest and deal with everything in the morning. But as I lay there, the storm outside intensified. The wind rattled the windows, and the trees outside groaned under the pressure. I kept hearing noises, like something moving around just beyond my sight. The silence between the gusts of wind felt too thick, like something was waiting. I didn't want to get up and check, so I just pulled the blankets tighter and tried to ignore it. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sounds outside, branches scratching against the cabin, a low moan of the wind, a thud against the wall. I convinced myself it was just the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, watching, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something heavy hitting the roof. It was no longer just the wind. There was something else, something big. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, straining to hear anything that would explain the noise. The storm had died down a little, but now there was something more disturbing. Then I heard it, a distinct scraping sound against the side of the cabin, followed by a heavy thud. I froze, my mind racing. It was too consistent to be a tree branch. It sounded like someone was trying to get inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly got up and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I crept toward the window, careful not to make any noise. Through the cracked blinds, I could barely make out the silhouette of something moving in the darkness, just outside the light cast by the cabin. I could see it now, a figure hunched over, moving slowly. The shape was difficult to make out, but I could tell it was tall, too tall for a normal person. My stomach churned, and I backed away from the window. My mind was racing. Who could be out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away. Couldn't be anyone local. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or something else. But then I heard it again, scraping at the cabin. Something was trying to get in. I didn't know what to do. I was alone. No cell service, no way to contact anyone. I checked the door, ensuring it was locked. Then I checked all the windows. They were all secure, but still, the feeling that something was out there trying to get in wouldn't leave me. My breath quickened as I heard another thud, this one much louder, like something had just slammed into the side of the cabin. I jumped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to hide, but where? There was nowhere safe in the cabin. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. I stood by the door, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside again, but there was something different about it. It was almost as if it was mocking me, a low, constant howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The scraping noise came again, louder this time. It was close, too close. I held my breath, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm in my chest. I could hear the thing moving around, circling the cabin. I felt a sudden panic rise in my throat, but I forced myself to stay still. My only chance was to wait, to let whatever was out there move on. Minutes stretched into hours. Felt like an eternity. The only sounds I could hear were my own breathing and the occasional scrape of claws against wood. It was getting colder now, the heat from the fire long gone. I felt the cold seep into my bones, but I didn't dare move. Every part of me was screaming to run, to get out of there, but the thought of being outside in the storm, with whatever that thing was, kept me frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The air grew still. The wind died down, and the forest around the cabin fell silent. I waited, my eyes scanning the darkness through the window, my ears straining to hear any sound. But there was nothing, only the faint patter of rain on the roof. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the silhouette of that thing outside. But the next morning, when the first light of dawn finally broke through the clouds, I cautiously stepped outside. The forest was eerily calm, nothing out of place. There were no signs of anyone, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing. Just the quiet of the woods, as if the night's events had never happened. I packed up and left Willow Ridge Cabin as quickly as I could, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town and got a signal on my phone that I felt safe again. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched that night, the feeling that something was out there in the dark, waiting, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. The road was barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. My tires crunched over the frozen gravel, the sound muffled by the howling wind outside. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and now I was driving blind, following a half-covered path that might not even lead anywhere. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches heavy with snow, swaying like skeletal fingers in the storm. I shouldn't have taken this shortcut. The car's heater was struggling, blowing lukewarm air that did little to fight the creeping cold. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, stiff and numb. The gas gauge was dipping dangerously low. I had no idea where the next town was, or if there even was one out here. Just wilderness, snow, and silence. Then I saw it, a cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, its wooden walls dark and weathered. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of the snow, and the chimney exhaled a thin wisp of smoke. Someone was here. Relief washed over me. Maybe they could point me toward the nearest town, let me use their phone, give me shelter until the storm passed. I parked the car, the engine sputtering before it died. The cold hit me like a slap as soon as I stepped outside. Snow seeped into my boots, biting at my ankles. The wind howled, pushing against me as I trudged toward the cabin. My breath came out in quick, visible puffs. The porch creaked under my weight. I raised a fist and knocked, the sound hollow against the thick wood. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Maybe they hadn't heard me over the storm. I tried the handle. Unlocked. The door groaned as I pushed it open. Warmth rushed out to meet me, carrying the scent of burning wood and something else. Something metallic. The inside was dim, lit only by the flickering flames in the fireplace. The air was thick, heavy. "Hello!" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. No reply. I stepped inside, my boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click. The cabin was small. One room with a kitchenette in the corner, a bed against the far wall, and a table in the middle. A single chair was pulled out, as if someone had just stood up. But there was no one here. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table, still steaming. Someone had been here. Recently, I moved further in, my pulse quickening. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The cabin felt too still, too quiet, like the air before a storm. Then I saw the blood, a dark smear on the floor, leading toward the back of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I followed it, my breath shallow. The trail ended at a closed door, a closet, maybe. I reached for the handle, stopped. What was I doing? This wasn't my cabin. I shouldn't be here. But the blood. I turned the handle. The door swung open. The smell hit me first. Iron and rot. The closet was small, cramped. And inside, slumped against the wall, was a man, dead. His throat was slit, the wound gaping, dark and wet. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His hands were bound behind his back with rough rope, the fibers digging into his skin. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone had killed him, and they were still here. The realization crashed over me like ice water. The coffee, the fire, the unlocked door. I wasn't alone. I spun around, scanning the cabin. The shadows seemed deeper now, hiding corners I hadn't noticed before. The wind outside rattled the windows, but beneath it, footsteps. Soft, careful, coming from outside. The door. I had left it unlocked. I lunged for it, my fingers scrambling for the bolt. Too late. The door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the snow. Tall, broad-shouldered, a hunting rifle slung over one arm. He didn't speak, didn't need to. I knew what he was here for, the dead man in the closet. And now me. I backed up, my legs hitting the table. The coffee cup rattled. The man stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor. He pushed the door shut behind him. The firelight flickered across his face. He smiled. I didn't wait. I grabbed the coffee cup and hurled it at him. It shattered against his chest, hot liquid splashing across his jacket. He snarled, swiping at it, and I bolted. Not for the door, he was blocking it. The window. I crashed into it shoulder first, the glass shattering. Cold air rushed in, snow stinging my face as I tumbled outside. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my side. Move. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the snow. Behind me, the cabin door slammed open. Run. I didn't look back. The trees swallowed me, branches whipping at my arms and face. The snow was deeper here, dragging at my legs like hands trying to pull me under. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold burning my lungs. A gunshot cracked through the air. Close. Too close. I ducked behind a tree, pressing myself against the bark. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. Silence. Then crunching snow. Slow. Deliberate. He was hunting me. I forced myself to breathe quietly, to think. The car. If I could make it to the car. Another step. Closer. I couldn't stay here. I lunged to the side, darting between the trees. Another shot. A bullet splintered the wood next to my head. Faster. The clearing came into view. My car sat where I left it, half buried in snow. Almost there. My fingers fumbled with the door handle. It was frozen shut. No. I yanked harder, my nails scraping against the metal. It gave with a groan. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut just as another shot rang out. The rear window exploded, glass raining over the seats. Keys. Where were the keys? My pocket. I jammed them into the ignition. The engine coughed. Come on. Sputtered. Died. The man stepped into the clearing, raising his rifle. I turned the key again. The engine roared to life. I slammed the gas, tires spinning in the snow before catching. The car lurched forward. The man dove to the side as I sped past, the bumper clipping his leg. He shouted, the sound lost in the wind. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The road was a blur, the storm swallowing the world behind me. I drove until the shaking stopped, until the cabin, the blood, the dead man, all of it was miles away. But I knew one thing. I would never tell anyone what I saw, because he was still out there, and he knew my face. I arrived at the cabin on a late autumn afternoon, the sky overcast and heavy with the threat of rain. The trees surrounding the small, isolated structure were thick with the remnants of a changing season, their leaves a mix of browns, yellows, and the occasional burst of red. The air felt damp, even before the first drops of rain began to fall. The cabin was a small, weathered place, sitting a few yards off a dirt path that wound through the forest. The wood was faded and cracked, and there was a slight lean to the roof, but from a distance, it seemed perfectly livable. I was here alone, just as I had planned, for a quiet weekend to disconnect. A chance to get away from the chaos of the city and the endless hum of daily life. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be simple. I carried my bags up the steps to the front door, the wooden planks creaking under my weight. The door was unlocked, as promised by the rental agency. I pushed it open, stepping inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, musty, like old wood and dampness. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was definitely distinct. The cabin's interior was rustic, with an old-fashioned feel. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it hadn't been used in quite some time. There were mismatched furniture pieces, a couch, a couple of chairs, a coffee table. Nothing looked new. Everything had the kind of wear that suggested it had seen its fair share of use over the years. I set my bags down in the small living room and wandered around, checking the place out. The kitchen was tucked off to the side, compact but fully functional. A small bathroom was in the back, with a clawfoot tub and an old-fashioned toilet. The bedroom, tucked away in a corner at the far end of the cabin, was simple. Just a bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the forest. As I unpacked and settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could place. The cabin was quiet, too quiet, and that nagging sense of unease seemed to follow me around. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was just being overly cautious. The rain picked up, a steady drizzle against the roof and windows. I lit the fireplace to warm the place up, hoping it would help with the odd feeling I had. I curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, with a book I had brought along to pass the time. Hours passed, and the rain continued to fall, the occasional gust of wind howling through the trees outside. By the time it was dark, the cabin had settled into a kind of eerie quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the steady patter of rain. I decided to turn in for the night, thinking that a good sleep would clear my head. The bed was comfortable enough, but sleep didn't come easily. Every so often, I'd hear a sound, a creak of wood, a faint shuffle. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but it didn't feel like that. The sounds were too deliberate, too measured, almost as if something or someone was moving around. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, straining to listen. There was nothing, just the wind outside. Still, the sense of unease refused to leave me. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and tried to force myself to sleep. But it didn't come. Hours dragged on, and finally, in the dead of night, I heard it again. A soft thud, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Not from outside, but from somewhere inside the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. I waited, listening as intently as I could. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was moving through the cabin, step by step. My pulse quickened. I was alone, wasn't I? I had checked the cabin thoroughly when I first arrived. There was no one else here. The footsteps came closer, the sound of them now unmistakable as they approached the bedroom door. I sat in complete silence, not daring to move, not even wanting to breathe too loudly. Then, just as quickly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the complete stillness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. There was no logical explanation. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Something, had been moving around inside the cabin with me. Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed, heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought, keeping it in my bag, and made my way to the door. I crept down the narrow hallway to the living room, scanning every corner, every shadow. Everything was as it should be. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, casting faint orange glows across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the windows. They were all locked, no sign of any forced entry. The door was secure. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside without me hearing. The footsteps hadn't made any noise when they stopped, as if they had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night on edge, pacing between the rooms, checking and rechecking everything, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sense of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. Morning came slowly, the rain finally tapering off as the sun began to rise behind the clouds. I tried to tell myself that it had all been a product of my imagination, that I had just been too caught up in the isolation. But the gnawing feeling remained. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't relax. I stayed close to the cabin, too anxious to venture into the forest like I had planned. That night, I decided to leave. I packed my bags quickly, not wanting to stay in that place a moment longer than necessary. But as I was about to leave, I heard it again. The same soft thud, the same slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they were right outside the door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to move. The door creaked, and for a split second, I thought it might open. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, ran out the door, and didn't look back. I made it to the car, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back there again. Looking back, I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, or maybe it was something else. But one thing I do know, that cabin wasn't as empty as it seemed. I had been planning this trip for months. A weekend alone in a small cabin in the woods, away from everything. No distractions, no people, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I thought it would be peaceful, a break from the noise of city life. Little did I know, it would turn into a weekend that would stay with me forever. The cabin was located a few miles outside of a small town, nestled deep in the forest. I had found it on an online rental site. It was rustic, one of those old wooden cabins that looked like it had been there for decades. It was perfect for what I wanted, isolated, small, and simple. The pictures on the site were charming, showing a cozy living room with a fireplace, a kitchen with old-fashioned appliances, and a porch that overlooked a small clearing in the woods. The kind of place where you could unplug, sit on a rocking chair, and just let time pass by. I needed that. I had been working nonstop and needed a chance to clear my head. The drive out there was longer than I expected. I was used to the hustle of the city, and the quiet roads started to make me uneasy. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw. The road eventually turned into a dirt path, winding around trees and over rocks. It was a typical late fall day, the air crisp with a hint of chill, the leaves changing color, but the sun still warm enough that I didn't need a jacket. I arrived at the cabin around 4 p.m., the sky just starting to darken. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, old but solid. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped up to the door, and I couldn't help but smile at the quaintness of it all. I unlocked the door with the key I had been given and stepped inside. The inside was just as I expected. It had that old, woody smell, the kind of scent that only a log cabin can have. The living room was small but cozy, with a fireplace that looked like it had seen plenty of fires in its time. There was a small kitchen off to the side with a couple of chairs and a table, perfect for meals, if you didn't mind sitting alone. I was looking forward to cooking some simple meals and just enjoying the solitude. The first night was uneventful. I spent a few hours getting comfortable, unpacking my things, and making a small dinner. Some pasta, nothing fancy. I sat by the fire, ate, and let the crackling warmth fill the space. I could hear the wind rustling the branches outside, and every now and then, A twig would snap somewhere in the woods, a distant sound that I assumed was some animal moving around. As the night settled in, I noticed how incredibly dark it was outside. No streetlights, no cars, just the pitch-black void of the forest. I'd always known the woods could be creepy at night, but being there in that quiet, isolated cabin made it feel different. Felt heavy, like there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I locked all the doors, closed the blinds, and crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tight around me. The sounds of the wind outside the cabin made it hard to drift off, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, gasping for breath, sitting upright in the bed. The room was pitch dark, and I had no idea what had pulled me from sleep. At first, I thought maybe I had just had a bad dream, but then I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the window. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't make out what it was at first. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, almost like it was being done with a finger. I sat frozen in the bed, straining my ears. There was no wind, no other sounds, just that tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness of the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I slowly got out of bed and walked toward the window, my steps feeling too loud in the silence. I pulled the blinds aside, shining the light outside. The beam moved across the dark porch and into the trees beyond. I couldn't see anything. The tapping stopped. I waited for a moment, but nothing came. Just the quiet of the night, the occasional rustling of branches. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch or something had brushed against the window in the wind. I locked the window, closed the blinds again, and climbed back into bed. But even as I lay there, trying to relax, the sense of unease lingered. The tapping had felt intentional, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I went outside to get some fresh air. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened the night before. I couldn't help but feel on edge as I made my way around the cabin, checking the windows and the porch. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of animals, no broken branches or footprints. Still, that feeling of being watched stuck with me. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I took a walk through the woods, snapped a few photos of the changing leaves, and made some lunch. But every time the wind would shift or a branch would crack, my heart would race and I'd look over my shoulder. I kept checking the windows of the cabin, almost expecting to see someone or something lurking outside. As the sun began to set again, I felt that same tightness in my chest. It wasn't normal to feel this uneasy in a place like this. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but I felt trapped. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, things escalated. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. It came from the side of the cabin, where there was a small window that looked out toward the woods. My mind raced as I lay in bed, frozen. The wind wasn't blowing, and there was no logical reason for anything to be tapping against the glass. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I had to know what it was. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the window, slowly pulling back the blinds. The forest was as dark as ever, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I scanned the yard, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything. I almost relaxed, telling myself it was probably just the house settling. But as I turned to walk back to bed, something caught my eye, a shadow moving just beyond the trees. It was quick, just a flash, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood there, staring out the window, my mind racing. Could have been an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the way it moved didn't seem right. It wasn't clumsy or erratic like an animal would move. It was too deliberate, too fast. I tried to push the thought out of my head. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just my overactive imagination. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every little sound, Every creak and groan of the cabin made me tense. The fear was growing, creeping in like the cold that slowly filled the room as the hours passed. The next morning, I packed up my things. I couldn't stay another night. My phone had no signal out here, and there was no way to contact anyone. I didn't feel safe. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that staying any longer would make things worse. As I stepped outside to load up my car, I glanced back at the cabin. The morning light made everything look so peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something in those woods, something I couldn't see but felt was there, watching me. I started the engine of my car, my hands shaking as I backed out of the driveway. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my eyes still fixed on the cabin, and I thought I saw a figure standing in the window. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and stayed there for the rest of the weekend. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still don't know what was out there in the woods. The tapping, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. All I know is that I've never been so relieved to leave a place in my life. I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left unexplored. I didn't expect my weekend at the cabin to be anything more than an ordinary escape from the city. I had been planning it for months. Just me, some time to myself, and the quiet of the woods. I had rented a small, remote cabin up in the mountains, far from any roads or people. The kind of place where the only sounds you hear are the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It seemed perfect. The drive to the cabin took longer than I anticipated, the mountain roads winding and narrow, the trees thick on either side. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I navigated the curves. There was no cell service up here, and the only sign of civilization was the small sign that marked the beginning of the dirt road leading to the cabin. It was the kind of place you couldn't accidentally stumble upon. No neighbors, no passing hikers, just isolation. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It looked exactly like I expected, wooden and weathered, with a sloped roof and a chimney that didn't seem to have been used in ages. The cabin was small, but there was something comforting about it. I wasn't planning to do much. Maybe a hike in the morning, a quiet evening with a book, and a little time to reflect on life. That's all I wanted. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Simple and unassuming. The walls creaked slightly when I walked around, and the furniture was old but sturdy. The smell of wood and dust filled the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. I unpacked my things, stored the food in the small fridge, and then sat by the window, watching the sunlight fade behind the mountains. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. That night, after a small dinner of canned soup and crackers, I settled into the worn armchair near the fireplace. The warmth of the fire was soothing as I stared at the flames, my thoughts drifting. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The air felt heavy, almost as if something was waiting in the shadows. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then, around midnight, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft thud, like something heavy falling on the porch. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a branch falling from the tree or a small rock being knocked loose. But then it happened again, this time louder, more deliberate. I froze in my chair, staring toward the door. My heart began to race as I listened, the silence stretching out around me like a living thing. Another thud, this time followed by a scrape, as though something was dragging across the porch. I stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The cabin was so quiet, every sound felt amplified. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I investigate, or should I stay inside, locked away, and hope whatever it was would leave? I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, shining it toward the door. The beam of light cut through the dark, but it only revealed a patch of wood and the night beyond. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a raccoon or some other animal rooting around. But the sound wasn't like that. It was too intentional. I moved cautiously toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I tried to push aside the feeling of dread that was creeping up my spine, but it was hard. I had no idea why I was so scared. I wasn't normally a jumpy person, but tonight felt different. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the cabin, suffocating it. With one final exhale, I reached for the doorknob and twisted it. The door creaked open, the cold air rushing in, carrying with it the smell of pine and earth. The porch was empty. Nothing was there. I stood for a moment, scanning the area, but there was nothing. Just the moonlight casting long shadows across the porch and the surrounding trees. I sighed, feeling both relieved and foolish. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and retreated back into the warmth of the cabin. I sat down again, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But as I was about to turn back to the fire, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the porch. It was coming from inside the cabin. A faint scraping sound, like something moving across the wooden floor upstairs. My stomach dropped. I had checked the place when I arrived. There was no one here. No one should have been here. I stood up quickly, my heart racing again. I was alone, wasn't I? I had checked everything. The windows were locked. The doors were secure. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. A slow, dragging noise from above. I was no longer thinking about animals. My mind raced with the possibilities. Someone had to be in the house. There was no other explanation. I grabbed the heavy flashlight again, my hand shaking as I flicked the switch. I moved toward the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. The light from the flashlight trembled as I ascended, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The air up here was colder, thicker. I reached the top of the stairs, my breath shallow. The second floor was small, just a couple of rooms. The hallway was narrow, and the floorboards creaked with every step I took. I could hear the scraping sound again, now unmistakably coming from the bedroom at the far end of the hall. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat dry as I approached the door. It was closed, but there was a small gap between the door and the frame. I could just make out the faintest shadow moving inside, like something shifting slowly, quietly. I reached for the door handle, my fingers numb, but before I could touch it, the scraping sound stopped. The air grew even colder, if that was possible. My heartbeat thudded in my chest as I stood frozen in place. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I had to know what was going on. I slowly, carefully, turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty. I blinked, confused. The bed was neatly made. The only thing out of place was a chair by the window, facing the dark woods outside. I stepped further into the room, the floor creaking beneath my feet. That's when I saw it. On the floor, near the corner of the room, was a small pile of dirt, freshly disturbed. It wasn't much, but the fact that it was there made my stomach turn. Someone had been here. There was no other explanation. But where had they gone? I backed out of the room slowly, my mind racing, the feeling of dread overwhelming me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. Something was wrong, and I had no idea what it was. The cabin, once a quiet, peaceful retreat, now felt like a trap. Just as I was about to turn to leave, I heard it again, footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw nothing. The room was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I bolted downstairs, my feet stumbling over the steps as I reached the front door. I was no longer thinking about the car or the road. I just needed to get out of there. When I reached the door, I found it wide open. I didn't remember leaving it like that. My heart stopped. The porch was empty, but the woods beyond it were dark and silent. I stepped outside, feeling the cold night air prickling my skin. The trees stood still, unmoving. I glanced around, my breath coming out in short gasps. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay any longer. I turned to leave when I saw something in the shadows. A figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still just at the edge of the trees. My blood ran cold. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stood there. I didn't think. I ran. As fast as I could. I sprinted to the car, my legs aching as I threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I wasn't waiting around to find out. I sped off, not caring about the road, the turns, or the distance. I just needed to get away. The image of that figure, standing motionless in the woods, burned into my mind. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't need to. I knew I had escaped, but I also knew that whatever I had felt there, it wasn't just my imagination. Something had been in that cabin, and it had been watching me the whole time. The drive down the mountain felt like it took forever, but when I finally hit the main road, I took a deep breath. I was safe, but I would never forget the cabin. I was burned out, that kind of mental exhaustion that builds over months, maybe years, between work pressure, my phone buzzing all the time, and never feeling truly rested. I reached a point where I couldn't think straight anymore. I wasn't sleeping well, barely eating right, and my heart would pound for no reason during the day. I decided to disappear for a bit. I didn't want beaches or crowded places. I wanted silence, nature. I wanted to be far enough from everything that the only thing I could hear at night was the wind and maybe a few birds in the trees. I found a small cabin listed on a website for off-the-grid getaways. It was in northern Minnesota, past a town I had never heard of. The listing said it had no cell service, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 10 days. I packed everything I thought I would need: canned food, a propane stove, water jugs, sleeping bag, clothes for cold nights, a battery-powered lantern, a flashlight with backup batteries, a small hatchet, and even a flare gun just in case. The place had a small wood stove, but you had to bring your own firewood or chop it yourself. I threw a couple bundles of firewood in the back of my truck. It was early October, so I figured it wouldn't get too cold, but it could drop low at night. I left early in the morning and drove most of the day. After passing through the last recognizable town, I kept going on smaller and smaller roads, and then onto a dirt path that barely looked like it could hold a car. Trees grew in thick on both sides. The leaves were turning yellow and orange, and there was this peaceful stillness in the air. Eventually, I reached a clearing, and the cabin sat in the middle of it. It was smaller than I expected. One room, a tin roof, a chopped woodpile to the side. There was an outhouse about 50 feet away in the trees. A narrow trail snaked off behind the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I stepped out of the truck and just stood there, letting the quiet settle in. I didn't hear a single car, plane, or voice, just wind moving through the branches and a faint creaking of trees leaning on one another. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A single cot, a wooden chair, a rough-built table, a small cupboard with a few empty glass jars. The wood stove had some ash still in it. There were black scuff marks on the floor near it, probably from boots. The windows didn't have glass, just wooden shutters you could latch closed from the inside. I unpacked slowly. I didn't want to rush anything. I wanted this whole trip to be slow. I stacked my supplies, filled the water container and set it up on a small shelf, rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, and made a quick meal of beans and bread. That night, I sat outside on a stump and watched the sun go down through the trees. The first night was peaceful, but I didn't sleep well. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. Every creak of the cabin or rustle in the trees made my ears perk up. At one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps near the outhouse. Slow, crunching steps on dead leaves. I sat up in my sleeping bag and just stared at the window for a long time. After maybe 10 minutes, I convinced myself it was a deer or a raccoon. The second day, I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and sat outside for a while. I walked around the clearing and looked at the trail that led off into the woods. I figured I'd explore that later in the week. I spent the day reading a paperback I brought, chopping some wood, and boiling water to wash up. It was simple. I felt calm. But that night, I heard something again. It was maybe an hour after I laid down. The fire in the wood stove was dying. The inside of the cabin was warm but dark. I had the lantern turned off. I was drifting towards sleep when I heard something behind the cabin, like something brushing up against the wall. It wasn't wind. It was a solid thump, then a dragging noise. I held still and listened, then nothing. I stayed awake for at least another hour. Nothing else happened. I told myself it was probably a tree branch or an animal again. Maybe even something falling from the roof. I didn't want to get up and check. The third day, I walked the trail behind the cabin. It was narrow and overgrown. After about 15 minutes of hiking, I found what looked like an old hunting blind up in a tree. The ladder was rotted out, and the wood of the platform had moss growing on it. I found some old cans scattered on the ground nearby. Some had bullet holes in them, but that's not what made me uneasy. Near the base of the tree was a length of rope. It looked old, thick, twisted, gray with age, and frayed at the ends. It was tied in a knot, not coiled like someone had left it behind neatly. It looked like it had been cut. I didn't like that. I kept walking a little farther, but the trail started to fade, and I turned around. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small. The hatchet I'd left stuck in the stump was now lying on the ground. I stared at it for a while. Maybe it fell. Maybe I didn't stick it in deep enough. But the ground wasn't soft, and the way it had fallen didn't look natural. It was lying about 2 feet from the stump, blade buried in the dirt. That night, I locked the shutters. I fed the stove more wood and kept the lantern on. I didn't sleep much. I kept sitting up and checking the room, listening to the wind and every small crack of branches outside. I didn't hear anything unusual that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The fourth day, I noticed tracks around the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine. I circled the whole place, looking at the dirt and fallen leaves. But there were prints that were too large to be mine. They were boot prints, and they were fresh. I walked around the cabin 3 times and tried to retrace my own steps from previous days. But these prints were new. They were spaced wider than mine, like someone with a longer stride. I followed them to the edge of the woods, then lost them. That evening, I sat inside with my flashlight and waited until dark. I didn't go outside. I didn't light the lantern. I wanted to hear everything clearly. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It sounded like breathing, not animal snuffling or sniffing. Breathing, heavy, slow, just outside the back wall of the cabin. I didn't move. The breathing lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, just silence again. I stayed awake until dawn. On the 5th day, I started thinking about leaving early. I had no cell service, and the cabin was a 2-hour drive from even the nearest sign of civilization. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but then I found something that made me stop pretending. Someone had tied string across the outhouse door. It was a thin brown cord, tied tightly across the door at waist height, fastened to 2 nails that hadn't been there before. I hadn't used the outhouse in 2 days. When I saw the string, I backed away and just stared at it for a while. I got this tight feeling in my chest, like my body knew something before my brain could catch up. That was when I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone was trying to scare me, or maybe worse. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with my flashlight in one hand and the hatchet in the other. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps, clear, slow, circling the cabin. The shutters were closed, but the sound of someone walking in dead leaves was unmistakable. They circled once, then again, then stopped. I didn't dare breathe loud. I didn't move. I sat completely still until the sun came up. On the 6th day, I started packing. I didn't care if I had paid for 4 more days. I had to leave, but when I walked around the cabin to load my gear, I found the driver's side door of my truck open. I never left it open. I would have heard the beep if it was ajar when I walked away from it. There was nothing stolen, but someone had gone through my truck. The glove compartment was open. My papers were scattered on the floor. My flashlight that I kept in the side pocket was gone. That was enough. I loaded everything as fast as I could. I kept the hatchet in my lap as I drove. My head was on a swivel the entire way out. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I kept driving for hours until I hit the first gas station. I didn't report it. What was I going to say? That someone breathed outside my wall? That someone tied a string on my outhouse? That someone opened my car but didn't steal anything? It all sounded crazy, but I know what I experienced. I don't think it was just a curious hiker or hunter. I think someone was living out there, watching, waiting, testing me, seeing how long I would stay, seeing if I would leave, seeing what I would do if pushed just a little harder. That trip was supposed to help me relax, but I've never been more tense in my life. I think if I stayed one more night, I would have seen whoever it was, or they would have come in. I don't know what they wanted, but I don't think it was just to scare me. People like that don't stop once they start. They push further. I've never gone back to the woods alone. I don't think I ever will. And every now and then, I still dream about the sound of slow footsteps in dry leaves circling my cabin. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. The thought of escaping the noise and rush of the city to spend a few days in the woods seemed like the perfect way to unwind. I found an old, secluded cabin online that had decent reviews. It wasn't too far from where I lived, so I figured I could get there quickly and make the most of my time. The cabin was set deep in the forest, far from any towns or other people. It looked like it had been abandoned for some time, but that's exactly what made it so appealing. No distractions, no one around to bother me. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday. The drive had been longer than I expected, but it was worth it when I finally saw the cabin. It looked a little run down, but still standing, surrounded by tall trees and thick brush. The front porch was creaky, and the wooden steps seemed to sag slightly under the weight of time. I grabbed my bags from the back of the car and slowly walked up to the front door. The cabin didn't have electricity, which I had known about beforehand. It had a wood stove for heating and a few candles, which I figured would be enough for the weekend. Inside, the cabin was dusty but cozy. It had a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, a simple table with chairs, and a couch in front of a stone fireplace. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the wooden floors creaked with every step I took. The windows were grimy, but the view of the forest outside was beautiful, peaceful. I set my bags down and took a moment to breathe in the stillness. There was something calming about being this far from civilization. As the sun began to set, I started a fire in the stove. It wasn't cold yet, but I wanted to get the place warmed up. I unpacked my things and found a few candles to light, giving the cabin a soft, flickering glow. The quiet was unlike anything I had experienced in a long time. No cars passing by, no voices, just the occasional rustling of the wind in the trees. I ate a simple dinner of canned food and settled in for a quiet night. I planned to spend the next few days hiking, reading, and just enjoying the solitude. That first night passed without incident. The sounds of the forest outside were soothing, the wind whispering through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling as the temperature dropped. It wasn't until I woke up in the middle of the night that things began to feel off. I'm not sure what it was at first. Maybe it was the stillness, the fact that everything around me was so quiet, or perhaps it was the strange feeling of being so far from anyone else. I wasn't sure. I had a hard time falling back asleep, my mind restless. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a noise outside, just beyond the window. It was faint at first, like a soft crackling or rustling. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or some small animal. But then it came again, louder this time. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was far from any main road, so what could it be? I tried to reassure myself, telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear passing by. But then I heard something else. A knock. It wasn't a normal knock, though. It was more like a heavy thud, like someone was pounding on the door. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe for what felt like an eternity. Whoever or whatever was outside, it wasn't supposed to be here. I had rented this cabin in a secluded spot for a reason, to get away from people. So why was someone knocking on my door in the middle of the night? I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and crept quietly toward the window. I peered outside, the beam of light sweeping across the dark yard. I couldn't see anything, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. No movement, no signs of life. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there. I sat back down on the bed, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. It was followed by another rustling sound, like something or someone was moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I stayed frozen in place, wondering what to do. Should I call the authorities? There was no cell service out here, no way to reach anyone. If someone were really out there, what could I do? I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. I was alone in this cabin, isolated, and it felt like the world outside was closing in on me. I spent the next few hours in a state of heightened alert, constantly listening for any sound. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind made me jump. The knocking didn't return, but the rustling continued, as though whatever was out there was waiting, watching. I kept the flashlight on, pointing it at the door and the windows, convinced that at any moment someone or something was going to break in. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, barely having slept a wink. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the trees outside. The cabin felt eerily quiet again. I didn't hear any rustling, no knocking, nothing. Still, I wasn't about to take any chances. I decided I would leave. Whatever had happened during the night, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching me. I hurried to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree. But the yard was empty, the forest still and silent. I threw my bags into the car and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I saw something strange. A figure standing just off the side of the road, watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I slammed on the brakes, but by the time I looked again, the figure was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I don't know if I imagined it or if it was real, but the image stayed with me long after I left the woods behind. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me after being alone in that cabin for so long. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had felt it, the presence of something in the woods, something that didn't want me there, and I had been lucky to escape. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about what had happened. I started looking into the area online, trying to find any information about the cabin or the land it was on. That's when I came across an article about a missing person case from several years ago. A woman had disappeared near the cabin, and though the authorities had searched the area, her body was never found. The article mentioned how strange it was that no one had ever come forward with any information. No witnesses, no suspects. Just like my experience, it was as if she had vanished without a trace. The thought of it made my stomach turn. I had been there alone in that cabin in the exact place where she had disappeared. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something I wasn't meant to know. Maybe it was for the best that I left when I did, because even though I never saw anyone, I knew I wasn't alone that night. Something had been out there, something I couldn't explain, but I wasn't going to be the one to find out what it was. As I sit here, safe and sound at home, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever go back to the woods. Part of me wants to find out what really happened at that cabin, but another part of me knows it's better to leave the past alone. Some things are better left unexplained, and some places are best left undisturbed. I think I made the right choice by leaving when I did. There's no way to know what would have happened if I had stayed, but I don't think I'll ever find out. I'm just thankful I made it out when I did, and I pray no one else has to experience what I did. I rented the cabin to get away from everything for a while. Not forever, just a week. I'd been working nonstop for almost 2 years, dealing with deadlines, stress, bad sleep, and noise from the city. My apartment felt more like a storage unit than a home. I was falling asleep with my phone in my hand and waking up to meetings and angry emails. I needed silence. I needed air that didn't smell like grease and car exhaust. So I found this place online, a cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was small, old, and cheap. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no paved road for 2 miles. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. With stove for heat, an outhouse out back. There was a single solar panel with just enough juice to run a few lights. I booked it for 7 days and didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want check-ins or calls. I wanted real quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, early October. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. The sky was clear, and the forest around the place was a mix of evergreens and trees already losing their leaves. The ground was covered in yellow and brown. The gravel path that led in was narrow and uneven. I parked just off the trail and carried my stuff the last 50 yards by hand. There was a small wooden porch with a bench, a rusty axe leaning against the side, and a single-pane window with one shutter hanging loose. Everything creaked. The cabin was probably built in the 60s and hadn't been touched since. Inside, it was one room, a cot with a thin mattress, a table with 2 chairs, some shelves with old pots and pans, and a cast iron stove in the corner. There was a big, dusty cooler for keeping food cold. No fridge. A few jugs of water stacked by the door. The outhouse was about 20 feet out back, built from the same rotting timber as the main structure. There was also an old metal drum half full of firewood. I brought freeze-dried meals, a solar lantern, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water for the week. I even brought a paperback I hadn't touched in a year. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, almost. The kind of silence you only notice when you've been surrounded by noise your whole life. No traffic, no neighbors, just wind and the occasional crack of branches. I stayed up sitting on the porch, bundled in a coat, sipping from a thermos. I listened to the forest. It made me feel small in a good way. The next day, I explored a little. I followed a deer trail for about an hour, then looped back. I saw no signs of people. No trash, no boot prints, no noise. It was exactly what I wanted. I spent the afternoon chopping a little wood, making tea on the stove, and writing in a small notebook I brought. I had no phone signal and didn't miss it. The sun went down early. I went to bed soon after, slept hard. The third day was when things started to feel off. I woke up around 6 a.m. to what I thought was wind hitting the window. It was still dark. The glass made this short, fast tapping sound. I lay still, listening. Then it stopped. I figured it was a branch or maybe an animal brushing against the side. The cabin was old and flimsy. Every movement outside felt amplified inside. But when I got up and looked out, there was nothing, just forest and darkness. Later that morning, I noticed something weird. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the edge of the tree line, was a dead rabbit. Not eaten, just lying there on its side, stiff. No visible injuries, not torn apart. It looked like it had just dropped dead. I didn't think much of it. Animals die all the time. Maybe it got sick. I didn't touch it, just noted where it was and walked away. That afternoon, I walked the same loop I did the day before. Only this time, I noticed something on the path. A small plastic wrapper, blue, crumpled, like the kind you'd find on a granola bar or candy. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought anything with wrappers. I squatted down, picked it up, and checked the brand. Something I didn't recognize. Foreign text. Cyrillic letters, maybe. I looked around but saw no footprints, no broken branches, no tire marks, just forest. I kept walking. I should have turned back then, but I didn't want to ruin the trip over a piece of trash. I told myself it must have blown in somehow. Maybe someone had been here weeks ago and it just stuck around. That night, I brought in a few more logs and lit the stove early. It was getting cold fast. I ate a dry meal and turned off the solar lantern around 9 p.m. The dark came down hard in that place. No stars, just pitch black. I lay there with the sleeping bag pulled up to my neck, staring at the ceiling, thinking about work and home and whether I could make this kind of isolation a regular thing. Then I heard it again, the tapping, this time slower, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Not wind, not a branch. I froze. It was coming from the window again. Same spot. I sat up and waited. Tap, then nothing. I didn't go to the window this time. I just stayed in bed, heart pounding, barely breathing. I told myself it was an animal, a bird, a raccoon, maybe a pine cone falling. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up around 4 a.m. freezing. The stove had burned out. I got up, threw a few logs in, and lit it again. Didn't check the window, didn't look outside. The next morning, the rabbit was gone. I walked to where it had been. Nothing. No fur, no bones, no tracks. The ground wasn't disturbed. It was like it had never been there. I checked around the area. Still nothing. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Every sound felt louder, every breeze more pointed. I kept looking over my shoulder. Later that day, I walked further than before, past the loop, deeper into the woods. I found a clearing with an old, rusted fire ring, just stones in a circle with some ash and beer cans. A makeshift bench made of logs. It had clearly been used, but not recently. The ground was damp and leaf-covered. Still, it was the first real sign that someone else had been in these woods in a long time. I didn't stay long. I made it back to the cabin around dusk. My legs were sore and I was tired. I felt better once I got the fire going again. The cabin didn't feel so creepy with light and heat, but something had changed. The axe was gone. It had been leaning against the porch since I arrived. I hadn't touched it, but now it was gone. I looked around the cabin. Nothing. Walked out to the side behind, checked the outhouse. Nowhere. I told myself maybe it fell. Rolled under the porch. I got on my hands and knees and checked. Nothing but dead leaves and dirt. Now I was starting to feel it. That tight feeling in the chest. The kind of nervousness you can't explain. I stayed inside that night. Didn't even step onto the porch. Just sat at the table and stared at the door, listening. I barely slept. I didn't hear tapping. Instead, I heard footsteps, crunching leaves, slow, heavy, moving in a wide circle around the cabin. I didn't move, just kept my eyes on the window and held my breath. The steps stopped after about 10 minutes, then nothing for the rest of the night. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed up everything as fast as I could, rolled up the sleeping bag, stuffed it in the pack, sealed the cooler. I took the solar lantern, the book, everything. I didn't care if I lost the remaining food or gear. I just wanted to go. When I stepped out, I saw something that made my legs go cold. Boot prints. Clear, fresh ones in the dirt and leaves, circling the cabin. Deep impressions. Not mine. Bigger. White soles. They went right up to the window, then around the back, toward the outhouse and back again. I didn't follow them. I didn't care where they went. I just started walking. I made it to the gravel trail, took a right and started the 2-mile hike back to where I'd parked the car. But when I got there, the car was gone. It was just gone. No glass, no tire marks, no signs of a struggle. Just the empty space where I had left it. I lost it. I dropped the pack and just stared, breathing hard, mouth dry. I looked around, tried to see if maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but I hadn't. I knew that moss-covered log, that split tree. This was the spot. I stood there for probably 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do. Then I heard the engine. Faint, distant, like a vehicle moving somewhere deeper in the woods. I waited. It got quieter. Then nothing. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell signal. No other cabins. No road. Nothing for miles. I could hike out, but I didn't know the direction or distance. I was off the grid, so I went back to the cabin. I didn't want to. I was scared out of my mind, but it was shelter. I didn't have a tent. The forest was cold. Night was coming. I needed to think. When I got back, the axe was on the porch again, placed perfectly, leaning the same way it had been on the first day. I didn't touch it. I just walked inside, locked the door, and sat in the corner with my knees pulled to my chest. I rented the cabin to get away from everything. I'd been working too many hours, sleeping too little, and the city noise had started to wear me down. It wasn't just the sounds of cars and people shouting at each other in the street. I'd grown tired of notifications, emails, my phone buzzing in the middle of the night, even the glow of screens. I wanted silence, a still place where I could sit with my thoughts, maybe read a book, maybe just stare out a window. That's all I needed. The listing looked good. A 2-hour drive into the mountains, then about 15 minutes on a gravel road, no neighbors for miles. The owner advertised it as an off-grid experience, which meant no power lines, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. There was a solar battery system for lights and a small wood stove for heat. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-bedroom structure with wood paneling, a front porch, and an outhouse in the trees out back. But it looked peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, a couple of books, some canned food, a backpack with warm clothes, a flashlight, batteries, my sleeping bag, a camping knife, a hatchet, and some basic cooking gear. I left my laptop behind, turned off my phone, didn't even bring my charger. I told a friend I was heading into the woods for a week and gave him the address, just in case something happened. He thought it sounded crazy to be totally unreachable, but that was the whole point. The drive was smooth until I hit the gravel road. It was narrow and winding, with trees brushing against the sides of my car. There were no signs or markers. I had to keep checking the printed map I brought to make sure I hadn't missed the cabin's turnoff. After a while, the road curved sharply around a rocky outcrop and opened up into a clearing. That was the first time I saw it, the little cabin tucked into the edge of the trees. It looked smaller than I expected, but somehow exactly right. The place was silent. No cars, no airplanes overhead, no voices. Just the sound of wind in the trees and the faint creaking of the old porch wood as I stepped up to the door. There was a rusted keybox screwed into the wall, just like the owner said, and the code worked on the first try. I stepped inside. It was a single open room with a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs near a window, and some shelves with books and old cooking supplies. The wood stove sat against the far wall, blackened from years of use but still functional. Everything smelled faintly of dust and dry wood. It wasn't dirty, but it wasn't spotless either. Just lived in, like someone had used it recently but hadn't bothered to clean much. A half-burned log sat in the stove. There were ashes in the pan. I figured the last guest hadn't bothered to empty it. I didn't care, felt fine. I unpacked, set my things near the bed, and walked the property. There wasn't much to see, just trees, a bit of open ground near the front, a narrow trail leading to the outhouse. I stood there for a while with my hands in my jacket pockets, listening to the wind. It was colder than I expected, and the shadows were getting longer already. I went back inside and got a fire going in the stove. That first night was peaceful. I sat at the little table and ate a can of chili heated on the wood stove. I watched the sky darken through the window. When it was fully dark, I lit one of the lanterns and read a few pages of an old paperback I'd brought. But I kept finding myself looking out the window, not because I was scared, but because it was so dark out there. I wasn't used to that. In the city, there's always some light, streetlights, signs, the glow from windows. Out here, the night swallowed everything. Still, I slept well. The bed wasn't great, just a thin mattress on a wooden frame, but I was tired. The fire kept the cabin warm, and I didn't wake up once until morning. The second day was quiet. I made coffee on the stove, walked a bit deeper into the woods, and gathered some fallen branches for kindling. I didn't see a single animal or bird, just some old droppings on the trail and a few broken branches high up in the trees. Maybe elk had passed through recently. I spent most of the day reading and writing in a notebook I'd brought. That night, I stayed up later, listening to the wind and the soft pops of the fire. I felt calm. The next morning, I noticed something that made me pause. I'd left my axe resting against the porch wall, and when I stepped out to get it, it was gone. I looked around, thinking maybe it had fallen, but it wasn't on the ground. I walked around the cabin twice. Nothing. It was just gone. At first I thought maybe I'd brought it inside and forgot. I checked near the stove, by the bed, under the table. No sign of it. It wasn't like me to misplace something like that. I'd only brought one. I stood on the porch and looked out toward the trees. The air was still, quiet, but something about the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. I tried to shake it off. Told myself maybe I was just tired, or maybe some animal knocked it over and dragged it off. But that didn't make sense. There weren't any claw marks or scratch trails. It hadn't been chewed. There weren't any signs of struggle or movement at all. It was like someone had picked it up and walked off with it. I spent the rest of the day jumpy. Every sound from the trees made me look up. I tried reading but couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, I locked the door for the first time. I knew it probably wouldn't matter if someone really wanted to get in. The walls were thin, the lock was old, but I did it anyway. I pulled the curtains closed and set one of the chairs under the doorknob like a wedge. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but not for long. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. Then another, then silence. Then it came again, closer. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I didn't move to the window. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just listened. Whatever it was, it stopped near the porch. I could hear the boards creak once, maybe twice. Then silence again. I stayed like that for over an hour, not moving, barely breathing. The fire had burned low. The air was cold, but I didn't dare get up to add more wood. I just sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and I finally got up and opened the door. The porch was empty, no footprints, no sign that anything had been there. I walked the perimeter of the cabin again, scanning the ground. I saw one spot near the outhouse where the leaves looked disturbed, like someone had brushed them aside, but that was it. I didn't feel calm anymore. I felt watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a deer, but I didn't believe it. Deer don't walk up onto porches. I spent the next day with my knife in my pocket and the hatchet, the only other one I found in the cabin, in my hand. I kept checking the windows. I didn't go into the woods. I didn't read. I just waited. That night, I built the fire high and stayed awake as long as I could. But sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off again. When I woke up, it was to the sound of a door creaking. Not the front door, the back one, the one that led to the woods. I shot upright and grabbed the knife. My eyes darted to the shadows near the stove. That back door didn't have a good lock, just an old latch. I hadn't even thought to check it before. I stepped across the room, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The door was slightly open. I pushed it shut and latched it. Then I sat with my back against it for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, didn't bother to clean up. I took the knife and the hatchet, loaded everything into my car, and drove. I didn't even eat. I just left. The road felt longer on the way out. Every bend in the trees made me glance behind me. Every movement in the brush made me tighten my grip on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit paved road. When I got back to town, I went straight to a diner and sat there for an hour just being around people. The noise of voices, the clatter of plates. It felt strange after so much silence, but comforting too. I thought about telling someone, maybe the police, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps and saw a door open? That my axe went missing? It wasn't enough. It wasn't proof. I didn't report anything, but I never forgot it either. 2 weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone, completely removed. No trace of the host's profile either. I tried the email I used to book it, but it bounced back as invalid. I don't know who was out there in those woods, but I know someone was. Someone who didn't want me there. And maybe I wasn't the first. Maybe I was just the only one who left. I needed a break. That's all it was supposed to be. Life had been grinding me down for months. Long shifts, back-to-back deadlines, bills, cold coffee, and the kind of background noise that never goes away no matter how late you shut your laptop. My head felt like it had a fog inside it all the time. I couldn't think straight, and I couldn't sleep more than a few hours each night. The city never stopped. It was like the buildings had a heartbeat and it kept pulsing into me. So when I found a listing online for a cabin way up north, surrounded by forest and not much else, it felt like the right answer. No Wi-Fi, no reception, no neighbors, just snow, trees, and quiet. I booked it for a full week. I didn't care that it was the middle of January. I had warm gear and chains for the tires. I wanted to freeze if it meant silence. The cabin was a 6-hour drive away, tucked beyond some logging roads that hadn't been plowed in years. I had to go slow once the pavement ended, creeping across patches of ice and compacted snow until I finally saw it. A small, one-story wooden cabin tucked just inside the tree line, not far from a frozen lake. The trees were tall and crowded, dark with snow clinging to their branches. It was already late afternoon when I got there, and the sky had that gray, bruised color that meant night would come fast. I turned the car off and stepped into air that bit straight through my coat. There was silence, a real kind, not just a lack of sound, but something heavier than that. Nothing moved. The only thing I could hear was the crunch of my boots and the wind through the trees. The cabin was basic, just like the listing had said. With stove, small kitchen with a gas range, a bed in the back, a bathroom with running water from a well out back and a septic tank. It smelled like old pine and dust. There were 2 windows in the main room and 1 over the bed. All of them looked out into forest. No curtains, no blinds, no insulation beyond thick wood walls. I didn't mind, felt raw and real. I lit the stove and unpacked my gear, warm clothes, a week's worth of food, a few books, a flashlight, and a portable radio I'd brought for emergencies. There was a generator in a shed next to the cabin, already fueled. It only powered the lights and water pump, and I only planned to run it a few hours a day. I didn't come here for electricity. I came for quiet. The first night passed without anything unusual. I read for a while by the stove, ate a can of chili, and crawled into the bed wearing 3 layers. The cold didn't bother me. The stillness did. It was so quiet it made me feel like I was underwater. My ears strained for something, anything. No cars, no sirens, no footsteps from the upstairs neighbors I usually heard back in the city. Just the wind and the occasional thud of snow falling from branches onto the roof. The next morning, I felt more rested than I had in months. I stepped outside with a thermos of coffee and looked around. Snow stretched in every direction, undisturbed. I walked a slow lap around the cabin just to take it all in. The lake was frozen over and smooth, with snow blowing across the surface. No animal prints, no sign of life. That changed on the 3rd day. It was early, maybe 6 a.m., still dark outside. I'd woken up to use the bathroom and glanced out the back window. At first, I thought I was seeing a shadow on the snow, something long and dark. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a trail, a broken line in the snow, leading from the woods toward the lake, curving gently like something had dragged across it. I grabbed my flashlight and boots. The cold hit me like a slap as I stepped outside. The air had that tight, biting cold you only feel below 0. I followed the trail slowly. The snow was disturbed in a way I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just a footprint or tire track. It was uneven, like something heavy had been pulled. The flashlight flicked over patches of red, dark red, frozen to the snow. Blood. It wasn't a lot at first, just a smear here and there. But the farther I followed, the more obvious it became. This was fresh, still bright in places, not fully frozen. Something had bled out here or was bleeding as it moved. The trail led all the way to the tree line near the lake, and then it stopped. No body, no tracks leaving, just blood and drag marks that faded into the brush. I stood there for a long time just staring. My breath came out in thick clouds. My ears started to hurt from the cold. I scanned the woods. Nothing, not even the sound of birds, just still trees. I turned around and followed my own steps back to the cabin. The rest of that day, I stayed inside. I kept thinking about what kind of animal could bleed that much and still move that far. A deer, maybe. A wounded elk. But even then, the tracks made no sense. No hoof marks. No prints at all. Just a drag. I tried to distract myself, made soup, chopped firewood, even tried meditating. But I couldn't stop thinking about that blood trail. Something about it felt off. It was too straight, too clean, like it had been done by someone, not something. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight by my bed, and every hour I got up to look out the window. Around 3 a.m., I saw something. Movement, just beyond the tree line where the trail had ended. I couldn't tell what it was, just a shape. Too tall to be a deer, too still to be an animal. It stood there for minutes. I blinked hard, wondering if it was just a trick of the shadows. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't go outside the next morning. I didn't want to know if the trail was still there or if it had gotten closer. I started the generator early just so I could hear something, anything besides the silence. But even with the low hum of the engine, I felt like I was being watched. I could feel it, the kind of pressure you feel on the back of your neck when someone's behind you. Every time I moved around inside, I checked the windows. I locked the door and shoved the table in front of it. Felt stupid, but I didn't care. That night, the silence broke. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard it. A dull thump, then another. Not sharp like a knock, heavier, like something pressing against the door, testing it. I sat up in bed, heart racing. I didn't move, just listened. Another thump, then something scraped. Not a claw, not metal. Something like wood or ice being dragged across the porch. I heard the creak of the boards. Slow, deliberate steps. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling and waited. Then nothing. Just silence again. I stayed like that until morning. When light finally came, I stepped outside. There were marks on the porch. Not prints, just rough scuffs like something had been pushed or dragged. I followed them down the steps, out toward the edge of the clearing. Then they stopped. The blood trail was back. Fresh, bright red. This time, it led around the cabin, past the window where I'd seen the shape. It looped to the shed. The door to the shed was wide open. I hadn't opened it. I walked toward it slowly, one hand in my coat pocket gripping the small hunting knife I'd packed. Inside the shed, the generator was still there, humming. But something had been moved. The gas can I'd stored beside it was tipped over, empty. The plastic cap was gone. I backed out and shut the shed door. I didn't care what it was anymore. Animal, person, something else. I just knew I didn't want to be there. I packed my things in silence. I didn't eat. I didn't sit. I loaded the car and turned it on, letting it idle while I double-checked every door and window. My hands shook the whole time. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to step out of the trees. As I backed out of the clearing, I saw something in the snow just past the edge of the driveway. A hand, pale, fingers spread, sticking out from under the snow like it had tried to reach the surface. I didn't stop. I didn't look closer. I kept driving, tires slipping and spinning on the ice, barely keeping control on the winding trail back to the highway. I drove the whole way home without stopping, without turning off the radio I had cranked up just to drown out the silence. I called the county sheriff when I got back, told them I'd seen signs of a wounded animal, maybe even a person. I left out the hand. I didn't want to sound crazy. They said they'd send someone to check. I never heard back. A week later, the cabin listing was gone from the website. I checked the satellite view on Google Maps. The road's still there. The clearing is still visible, but the cabin is gone, like it was never there at all. I don't know what I expected when I booked that place. Maybe I thought I'd finally get some peace. I wanted to write. I told myself I needed the isolation, the distance from people, the kind of quiet you can only get when you're surrounded by trees and nothing else. I found the listing late one night, a small, simple cabin in Oregon, several miles off any main road. No neighbors, no towns close by, no internet. Just 4 wooden walls, a wood stove, a bed, and a table. Perfect. I wanted to disappear for a while. I didn't want distractions. I didn't want noise. I wanted silence. That was the idea, at least. I drove out there in mid-October. Leaves were already changing, painting the landscape in deep reds and oranges. The air had that cold bite in the mornings that hinted winter was coming. Felt perfect. Felt still. The directions were clear enough. I took an unmarked dirt road off the highway and followed it for about 9 miles through increasingly dense forest. The trail narrowed to the point where branches scraped the sides of my SUV. At some point, I remember thinking how weird it was that there weren't any signs or markers, just the GPS and a line on the map that stopped where the cabin should be. I found it tucked between 2 ridges, hidden in the trees like it had been built to be forgotten. A narrow clearing formed a sort of yard, all overgrown and unkempt. The cabin itself looked old but solid. Faded brown paint, heavy wood-framed windows, a sagging porch with 2 steps that creaked under my weight. It didn't matter, it was everything I wanted. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. It's hard to describe the silence in a place like that. No cars, no planes overhead, no distant hum of anything. Just whined through the trees. Maybe a bird sometimes, or the sound of something small in the underbrush. But even that felt like it was miles away. I brought enough food for 2 weeks. Canned stuff, dry goods, a cooler with some perishables I planned to use early. There was a rainwater tank behind the cabin that fed a sink inside, and a compost toilet in a little outhouse about 20 feet behind the building. I had a flashlight, lanterns, batteries, books, a stack of legal pads, pens, no laptop. That was the point. I didn't even bring my phone. I spent the first few days settling into a routine. I'd wake up just after sunrise, make instant coffee on the small propane burner, sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket and watch the fog drift between the trees. Then I'd write for a few hours, break for lunch, maybe walk the trails I found behind the cabin, then come back and write again until it got too dark to see clearly. By the time I lit the lantern in the evenings, I was usually so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. The second night, I heard something strange. I was lying in bed, drifting off, when I thought I heard footsteps outside. Not animals, heavier, deliberate, slow. It was faint, but in a place that quiet, any noise seemed louder. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just the creaking of the cabin and the wind in the trees. I chalked it up to my nerves. Maybe I was too used to city noise and didn't know how to relax without it. But the feeling stuck with me, like someone had walked by the window and stopped, like someone had been watching. I checked the area the next morning but didn't see anything strange. No tracks in the dirt, no signs of anyone. Still, I started locking the door at night even though I hadn't planned to. That's when I realized the door didn't even have a real lock, just a sliding bolt. It didn't make me feel any better. By the 5th day, I started noticing things that felt off. The first was the feeling that the path behind the cabin, one of the trails I'd been walking, had been disturbed. At first, I thought it was just my own prints. But the more I looked, the more I realized some of them didn't match my boots. They were similar, sure, but not the same tread. A little wider, a little longer. Someone else had walked there. Then I found the pile of sticks. It was about 100 yards down the path, near a split in the trail. A neat, almost too neat pile of snapped branches stacked in a triangle. It didn't look like windfall or debris. It looked placed, deliberate. I stared at it for a long time before I kicked it apart and walked back to the cabin. I didn't like how it made me feel. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept imagining I was hearing footsteps again. At one point, I got out of bed, grabbed the lantern, and opened the door. Nothing, just cold air and trees. I stood there for a long time, half expecting to see someone just standing at the edge of the clearing. The next day, I found something else. A torn piece of fabric, caught on a nail sticking out of the porch railing. It was small, maybe 2 inches, dark green, and looked like it came from a jacket or pants. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I hadn't worn anything that color or material since arriving, and I would have noticed a loose nail like that. I walked the perimeter of the cabin twice. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. The presence, that sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't in my head. Someone had been close enough to brush against the railing. After that, I stopped walking the trails. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the lantern with me at all times, even during the day. Every sound started to feel threatening. Every shift in the wind, every branch snapping in the woods. I kept telling myself it was probably just another hiker. Maybe someone else had a camp out here, but I never saw anyone. Not once. Then I found the footprint. It was in the dirt about 15 feet from the outhouse, behind the cabin where the trees thickened. Deep, fresh, bigger than mine. No boot tread barefoot. Who the hell walks barefoot out here? It wasn't normal. I stared at it for so long my legs started to ache from crouching. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lantern on. I sat in the chair by the door, facing it, blanket wrapped around me, holding the only thing I had that could pass as a weapon. A small hatchet I'd used to split kindling. Just before dawn, I thought I saw movement outside. It was quick, just a flicker at the edge of the clearing. Something dark. I got up and moved to the window, heart pounding, but whatever it was had disappeared. Later that day, I walked a wide circle around the cabin. I found 3 different spots where the brush had been disturbed. Bent branches, flattened leaves. Someone had been moving through there, watching. I was sure of it. I wanted to leave, but the drive back to the highway would take almost 2 hours. And I hadn't seen any gas stations or rest stops on the way in. I didn't even know if I could make it out on what I had left in the tank. And I didn't want to break down out here. I figured I could last a few more days. Just finish what I came to write and leave early. But I should have left that morning. The last night, it got worse. It was about 2 a.m. I'd fallen asleep with the lantern still burning. Something woke me. Maybe the sound of the wind, maybe something else. But I was instantly alert. I knew something was wrong. The air felt wrong. Still, heavy. Then I heard it. A scrape. Right outside the door. Not an animal. Not wind. Something dragging slowly across the wood. Then a thud. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat frozen, listening. Nothing. Then slowly the doorknob turned. It didn't open, but someone tried. They twisted it back and forth like they were checking the latch. I reached for the hatchet, heart hammering. I thought they might break the door down. I thought I might have to fight, but they didn't try. After a few seconds, the knob stopped moving. Then footsteps, slow, heavy, walking around the cabin. They stopped under the window. I didn't look, couldn't. I just sat there, holding my breath, gripping the hatchet with both hands, waiting. I don't know how long they stayed. Felt like hours. But eventually, the footsteps faded. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. I threw the food in the back, grabbed my papers, my gear, everything. I didn't care how much gas I had left. I was getting out. The road out felt longer than I remembered. Every shadow in the trees looked like a person. Every bump made me think the tires were about to blow. But I didn't stop. I kept going until I hit pavement again. When I finally got to a small gas station back near the highway, I told the clerk what had happened. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, sometimes people live out there, off-grid. Not always the friendly kind." That was it. I never went back. I deleted the listing. I don't even know if it's still up. Maybe someone else is staying there now. Maybe someone else is finding footprints and pieces of fabric. Maybe they'll stay longer than I did. Maybe they won't be so lucky. I haven't written anything since. Not one word. I drove up the mountain with the plan of spending 4 quiet days in the cabin I'd rented through a private listing. It was early November, and the area hadn't seen snow yet, though the forecast hinted at colder weather in the days ahead. I packed food, water, firewood, and a couple changes of warm clothes. The cabin was advertised as remote and off-grid, with no running water and only a wood stove for heat. That was fine by me. I wanted to be alone, just me and the quiet of the mountains. I didn't realize how truly isolated I'd be. The dirt road leading up to the cabin wound through dense trees, and after about an hour of driving slowly uphill, I reached a small clearing. The cabin sat in the center. It was smaller than I expected. The structure was made of weathered pine logs, and the roof had a sheet metal patchwork on top of old shingles. The front porch had a crooked step, and a rusty folding chair leaned against the wall beside the door. A narrow trail ran off to the side of the property and disappeared into the woods. I figured it led to an old logging path or a hunting route. I parked the truck close to the porch and shut off the engine. Immediately, the quiet settled over everything. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic, just silence. It felt peaceful, but also a little unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shook it off and went inside. The door creaked loud as I opened it, revealing the dark interior. The cabin smelled like old wood, smoke, and something sour, like mildew. Inside, there was one main room with a low ceiling, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a narrow cot pushed up against the wall. The place was dusty, but nothing seemed damaged. There was a small table and chair, a couple of cracked ceramic plates, and an old oil lantern hanging on a hook. A single window faced the front yard, and a second one was above the bed in the back wall. There were no curtains. I brought in my gear, stacked some of the dry firewood by the stove, and lit a small fire to take the chill off. I kept my boots on because the floor was cold and there were small gaps between some of the boards where I could feel the breeze creeping up from underneath. After I got everything inside and ate a sandwich, I sat down on the cot and looked out the front window. The trees around the cabin looked thicker than I remembered from the drive up. Maybe it was just the way the sun cast the shadows. It was already dipping low in the sky, even though it wasn't that late. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped fast. I layered up and kept the fire going steady. The wind finally picked up outside, whistling through the eaves of the roof and rattling the metal roof sheets. Around 9 p.m., I stepped outside to use the bathroom, just a basic outhouse about 20 yards into the woods out back. As I stepped off the porch, the wind died again. I paused, listening. The trees were still, and the air was bitter cold. I walked quickly across the yard, flashlight in hand, my breath fogging in the beam. The outhouse door creaked when I opened it. It smelled as bad as you'd expect, but it was functional. As I came back toward the cabin, I paused halfway to the porch. There were faint indentations in the frozen grass near the side of the house. They didn't look like animal tracks, too long, too narrow. They almost looked like someone had paced there in boots, back and forth. I crouched to get a closer look, but the wind kicked back up and I didn't want to stay out long. I told myself maybe I had walked there earlier and forgot, though I didn't remember going around to that side. I went back in, locked the door behind me, and tossed a few more logs into the stove. Sleep was hard to come by that night. The cabin groaned with every gust of wind. I heard faint creaks on the porch around midnight. I sat up, holding my breath. The floorboards out front made a very distinct sound when stepped on, the groaning, cracking sort. I waited, ears straining in the dark, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I drifted off for a few hours. The next morning, the world was white. Sometime in the night, snow had started falling, and now everything outside was covered. The wind had stopped, but the sky was overcast and heavy. I made some coffee on the stove and ate jerky and crackers. I went outside to check the truck. The snow was about 6 inches deep and still coming down steadily. The dirt road I came up was already invisible. I figured I'd wait it out. Maybe a day or two of snow wasn't a big deal. I had enough supplies. Then I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, coming from the trees along the right side of the cabin, circling wide around the clearing, and stopping at the edge of the woods directly behind the outhouse. They weren't my tracks. These were spaced out longer and deeper, like someone had been running or moving quickly. The strangest part was that they didn't continue in either direction. They just stopped. It didn't look like the person had walked in or out, just appeared there and disappeared again. I walked over and followed them as far as I could, but they vanished about 10 feet into the woods behind the outhouse. I looked around, but the trees were too thick to see far. No movement, no sound. The air felt still and too quiet again. I walked back, checking the edges of the clearing, but didn't see anything else. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some hunter or hiker from the day before, even though I hadn't seen another soul on the road coming up. Still, it was possible, right? I went back inside and locked the door again. That evening, the snow turned heavier. Thick, wet flakes that fell fast. By the time it was dark, the snow was nearly a foot deep. I kept the fire going, checked my food, and bundled up. I tried to read one of the old books I found on the shelf near the window, some dusty novel from the 60s, but I kept glancing toward the window. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Every time the wind pushed against the cabin or a tree branch creaked outside, my pulse jumped. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Clear this time, slow, deliberate, creaking floorboards under weight. I froze. The fire was low and the only light in the room was from the lantern. I didn't move. I could hear it shifting weight, one board groaning, then the next. Then it stopped. I sat perfectly still, trying not to breathe too loud. I thought about grabbing my hunting knife from my pack, but I didn't want to make noise. A few minutes passed. Then I heard another sound, softer, almost like fabric brushing against the outside wall near the window. I got up slowly and stepped across the room, careful not to make the floor creak. I crouched low beneath the window and listened. Silence again. No movement. I waited there, muscles tight, for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I got back into bed and stayed fully dressed, just staring at the ceiling in the dim lantern glow. Morning finally came, still snowing. I went outside and saw more footprints, this time clear tracks circling the cabin multiple times. They were deep, spaced just like before, too long to be mine. They went around the porch, behind the cabin, and vanished into the trees again. There were no tracks coming toward the cabin, only around it, like someone had been watching, over and over. No animal made tracks like that. That day, I shoveled a path to the truck and tried to drive out. The tires spun in the snow. I couldn't get traction. The slope leading back to the road was too steep now. I gave up after half an hour. I was stuck. By that night, I had blocked the windows with firewood and shoved my cot in front of the door. I kept the fire going hot and sat up with the knife in my hand. I didn't hear anything that night, but I barely slept. The third day was worse. The snow had stopped, but now a thick fog had moved in. I couldn't see more than 10 feet out the window. I walked around the inside of the cabin all day, just pacing, trying not to lose it. I checked my food. Still enough for a couple days, but I was burning through firewood fast. That night, I heard something outside again. This time it was faster. Footsteps running, crunching in the snow, moving back and forth. Then silence. Then again closer. Then further away. I didn't know if it was one person or more. I waited, holding my breath, knife still in hand. My mouth was dry. I had never felt fear like that, not even close. It wasn't just being watched anymore. It felt like something was testing me. Just before dawn, I finally heard the truck alarm chirp once. Then again. I hadn't locked it, but the horn made that same chirp when the door was opened. Someone had opened it and closed it. I waited until daylight before going outside. The snow was disturbed all around the truck. The door was open. Nothing was missing, but everything inside had been moved around. My glove box was emptied. The seat was pushed back like someone had reclined in it. There was a single deep boot print in the snow beside the driver's door, and a long drag mark, like someone had knelt or fallen there. I checked the rest of the area. No other signs, no people, no animals. Just the sound of the wind picking up again and the trees swaying slowly in the gray light. I spent the last day in the cabin with the fire blazing and the door barricaded. I didn't leave. I barely moved. I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. I had always thought I'd enjoy the peace of a secluded cabin, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. It sounded perfect, the quiet, the fresh air, and the simplicity of being away from everything. I booked it online without giving it too much thought. It was a small, rustic cabin nestled deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I didn't mind being alone, so I rented the cabin for a week, planning to do nothing but relax and clear my mind. The drive up was scenic, with tall trees lining the roads, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The air was crisp, and the more I drove, the more isolated I felt. First, I found it peaceful, but as I got further into the woods, a strange feeling began to settle in. The road narrowed and the trees grew denser. There were fewer cars, and soon I realized I hadn't seen another soul for miles. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. Small, wooden, with a pitched roof, surrounded by tall trees. The porch had a couple of old chairs, and the air smelled of pine and earth. I grabbed my bag from the car, walking up the creaky steps to the door. There was a key hidden under the doormat, just as the instructions had said. I let myself in. The cabin was cozy, but also bare. A stone fireplace sat on one side of the room, and a small kitchen was tucked against the far wall. There was a single bedroom at the back, a bathroom off to the side, and a large window that looked out over the woods. I tossed my bag on the bed and opened the window, letting the cool breeze in. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. I sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. It was so quiet. No birds, no cars, not even the sound of wind through the branches. The stillness was almost suffocating, but I figured I would get used to it. After all, that was the point of being here, right? That night, I made a simple dinner. Pasta with some canned sauce, nothing fancy, and sat at the small wooden table to eat. I didn't have any plans to go out. The sun went down, and with it, the temperature dropped significantly. The warmth from the fireplace felt good as the cabin grew colder. As the evening wore on, I started to feel restless. The quiet, the isolation, it was starting to feel wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more like an unease that I couldn't shake. I tried reading a book, but my mind kept drifting. The flickering light from the fire didn't help, casting strange shadows on the walls. I turned the television on, but the reception was poor. I couldn't get a clear picture or sound, so I turned it off. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was old but comfortable enough. I turned off the lights and lay there, staring at the ceiling. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, the sound of branches tapping against the windows making it feel even more remote. Then I heard something, a sound from outside the cabin. It wasn't a usual sound like the wind or animals. It was a slow, deliberate scraping noise, like something or someone was dragging their feet across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, listening closely. The noise continued, now shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. I couldn't tell if it was the wind, an animal, or something else. I grabbed the flashlight by the bed and shone it through the window, but I couldn't see anything. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the blackness of the woods, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My mind raced. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. A deer or a raccoon, perhaps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noise stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was just silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Scraping, dragging, like something or someone was walking around the cabin. I froze. My mind was spinning. Should I go out and check? No, that was a bad idea. I had to stay inside, stay safe. The noise moved again, back to the far side of the cabin, then disappeared completely. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally let go of the flashlight and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. My heart was still racing, my mind still whirling with questions I couldn't answer. What had that been? Who or what had been outside? I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, the shadows of the trees outside moving with the wind, playing tricks on my mind. The next morning, I went outside to check the ground around the cabin. I searched for any signs of what might have caused the strange noise, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. I felt foolish for getting so worked up. It was probably just an animal. That's all it was. But even as I convinced myself of that, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. I stayed at the cabin for the rest of the day, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet, but the feeling of unease lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't until later that night, as I sat by the fire again, that I realized the cabin was still too quiet. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustling of leaves, no insects chirping, nothing. It was like the world had fallen silent. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, watching. As the night wore on, I once again found myself listening for any sounds outside. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was scared. I couldn't understand why. Why should I be scared? I was alone, in a cabin, in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be peaceful, relaxing, but that night it wasn't. That night, the silence pressed in on me, and I began hearing the scraping noise again, this time closer than ever before. I rushed to the window, shining the flashlight into the trees, but I saw nothing. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, every part of me on edge. The wind picked up again, rattling the trees, but I could still hear the dragging noise. I couldn't explain it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to resist the urge to run outside and check. Then it stopped. Just like the night before, the noise ceased suddenly, and I was left with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening, but nothing happened. The next day, I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to figure it out. I felt foolish, but at the same time, I didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just outside the cabin, waiting. The drive back was long, and as I pulled away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods seemed so still, so silent, as if they were waiting for me to come back. And I never did. I never went back to that cabin, not once. The memory of those nights haunted me, and no matter how hard I tried to forget it, the feeling of being watched stayed with me. It wasn't just the silence or the strange noises. It was the overwhelming sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't understand. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But every time I think back to that cabin, to those long, lonely nights, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods, something that didn't want me there, and it's a feeling I'll never forget. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me, the quiet cabin, and the great outdoors. I'd been planning this for months, renting a secluded cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. It felt like the perfect escape. I had every intention of making it a relaxing trip, away from the noise of everyday life. When I first arrived, I was struck by the stillness, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I was in my late 20s, not inexperienced with the outdoors, but definitely not a seasoned camper either. My friends had often told me to be careful about venturing out into the wild alone, but I figured I'd be fine. After all, the cabin was just a few miles from the nearest town, and the road to get there was well maintained. The cabin itself was older but cozy. It had a thick stone fireplace, which I loved the moment I saw it. The wooden beams in the ceiling gave it an old, rustic feel that made it feel more like a home than just a place to stay for the weekend. The air was cool and fresh when I stepped out of my car, and I took a deep breath, soaking in the moment. There was something calming about it, even though I wasn't used to being completely alone in such a secluded place. I unloaded my bags and made my way inside. The interior was just as charming as the exterior. Wooden floors, a large, comfortable-looking couch by the fireplace, and a kitchen that was simple but had everything I'd need. I set my things down, unpacked a little, and decided to take a short walk around the property to get a feel for the area. I wasn't in a rush. I'd planned on staying for 3 days, and I wanted to savor every moment. The land around the cabin stretched out into a dense forest. There were trails nearby, and the more I looked around, the more I realized how isolated the place was. I couldn't see or hear anyone else. There was no sign of life beyond the trees. I felt a strange sense of peace mixed with a little unease. It was the kind of place where you could easily get lost if you weren't careful. After walking for a while, I noticed a small stream running through the woods. It was peaceful, the sound of the water trickling over the rocks soothing. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It was one of those moments where you feel connected to the earth, the way things should be. But as the sun started to dip behind the trees, a strange feeling crept over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about the place that felt off. I shook it off, though. I was probably just being paranoid. I headed back to the cabin as the sky darkened. The first evening went by quietly. I made a simple dinner, read a little by the fire, and then turned in early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I fell asleep easily. But as the night wore on, I started to hear noises outside. It was subtle at first, just the faintest sounds, like twigs snapping or the rustle of leaves. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I listened, the more certain I was that there was something out there. It wasn't just animals. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or maybe a deer, but the sounds were too deliberate. There was a feeling of someone, or something, moving around the cabin, just outside my window. I got up and looked out, but there was nothing. The yard was bathed in moonlight, empty except for the trees. I felt a chill run through me, but I shook it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, nothing more. The next day was sunny, and I decided to stay busy. I went for a longer hike, explored more of the trails, and even spent some time near the stream again. As the day wore on, I started to feel better, less on edge. Maybe it had just been the isolation the night before. Being out in nature like this, so far from civilization, was a different kind of quiet that I wasn't used to. But that evening, things took a turn. It started with the same noises again. The twigs, the leaves, the sense that something was moving around the cabin. This time, however, it was more persistent. I could hear it circling the cabin, something shifting just outside my range of sight. My heart started to race, and I found myself clutching the edge of the counter, willing the noise to stop. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the pattern didn't make sense. The sounds weren't random, they were too deliberate, too close. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and went outside, hoping to put my mind at ease. The night was still and quiet, with the kind of darkness that wraps around you. I didn't see anything, no animal tracks, no signs of movement, but there was an eerie stillness in the air that felt wrong. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, double-checked the perimeter, and then went back inside. I was beginning to feel like I was overthinking things, but a small part of me wondered if I was alone in the cabin after all. I kept the lights on and stayed near the fire, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to think about what could be out there, just beyond the trees. That night, the noises came again, but this time they were closer. I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, crunching through the underbrush, as if someone was pacing around the cabin. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I felt exposed, trapped in the middle of nowhere with no one around to help. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't have enough battery to make an emergency call even if I could. I had to rely on myself. I decided to take a look outside again. I stepped out onto the porch, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The night air was cold, and I could see my breath in the moonlight. The footsteps stopped. Everything was still, so still that I almost didn't believe it. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. I waited, listened, and then I heard it again. A movement in the brush, a rustling noise. Someone was definitely out there. I had no choice but to confront whatever or whoever it was. I grabbed the biggest stick I could find and moved cautiously toward the edge of the property. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. I kept scanning the trees, the underbrush, waiting for something, anything to jump out at me, but nothing did. The woods were eerily silent again. I waited until I was sure I wasn't being followed or stalked, then returned to the cabin. I locked the door behind me and didn't venture outside again. I spent the rest of the night trying to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually won. I fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by the idea that I wasn't alone. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining again. It was almost too bright, too calm, as if the forest itself had decided to go back to normal. I didn't trust it, The quiet had become a constant companion, a reminder of how isolated I really was out there. I spent the rest of the weekend nervously checking the windows and keeping my flashlight close by. The noises never came again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't feel safe, even though the daylight was bright and welcoming. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain it. By the end of the weekend, I was more than ready to leave. The drive back was a blur. I didn't look back at the cabin. Couldn't. The whole experience left me shaken, unsure of what I had heard or what had been out there. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going back to that cabin. Whatever it was, whatever I felt out there in the woods, was something I didn't want to experience again. The strange feeling of being watched faded with time, but the memory of that weekend still lingers in my mind. The cabin was too quiet, too isolated, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the feeling that I was never really alone out there stayed with me. It was a reminder that sometimes silence is the loudest thing you'll ever hear. I didn't know how I ended up agreeing to this. I'd been looking for a break from the noise of the city, the endless hustle of everyday life, and the weight of work that seemed to cling to me even when I wasn't at the office. It sounded like the perfect escape. A weekend alone at a secluded cabin in the woods, just to get away, to breathe. I needed silence, but what I found wasn't peace. It was a nightmare. The cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Remote, rustic, and isolated from everything. It had been described to me as a place to unplug. No internet, no phone service, just nature and quiet. I'd looked up pictures of it online before I left, and it seemed like just what I needed. Simple, with an old stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a wooden deck overlooking a valley, and windows that let in the sunlight during the day. The type of place that made you feel like you could breathe again. I drove up to the cabin early on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, winding through thick forests and over hilly terrain. The further I went, the fewer people I saw, until it was just me, the road, and the trees. At some point, the paved road turned into a gravel one, which rattled my car. The sun was starting to dip when I finally arrived, casting long shadows over the woods. The cabin looked just like the photos, sitting there quietly at the edge of the forest. A log cabin with a steep roof, its windows reflecting the fading light. No neighbors in sight. Couldn't help but smile a little. This was exactly what I wanted. Isolation. I unlocked the door with the key the rental company had left for me, stepped inside, and was immediately hit with the smell of wood and dust. It wasn't unpleasant, just the scent of an old cabin. The place was simple but comfortable. The living room had a large stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a small coffee table. The kitchen was basic, old-fashioned, but functional. There were a few canned goods and dry foods stocked in the cabinets, which was good enough for me since I hadn't planned on cooking anything elaborate. A small bathroom with a clawfoot tub was tucked behind a door at the back, and there were 2 bedrooms upstairs. The whole place was exactly as advertised, and I felt a sense of relief. I made a quick dinner, ate alone at the small kitchen table, and then settled down on the couch. The quiet around me was almost overwhelming. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. There were no sounds of cars, no distant chatter, just the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the creaking of the old wooden beams. As night fell, I built a fire in the stone fireplace, hoping the warmth and the crackling sounds would make the place feel more like home. I put my phone on the table next to me, but it wasn't getting any service, not that I minded. For once, I was free from the constant notifications and emails. The night stretched on. I kept the fire burning for a while, but it was so quiet, so unnervingly quiet. I eventually went upstairs to bed, telling myself that I would sleep deeply after all that driving. The bedroom was small but cozy, with an old iron bed frame and a patchwork quilt. The windows were open just a crack, letting in the cool night air. I pulled the quilt up and settled in, but even with the comfort of the bed, sleep didn't come easily. The first thing that unsettled me was the sounds. At first, they were soft, subtle, almost like a whisper of movement outside. Leaves brushing together in the wind, maybe, But it wasn't the wind. No, there was something else. Something deliberate. I lay still, listening intently. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too precise, like footsteps. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the trees or a branch falling in the distance. But as I strained to hear, it sounded closer, closer than I liked. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel, slow and measured. Someone was out there. I froze, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. The footsteps came closer to the cabin, and I felt the chill of fear crawl up my spine. I couldn't be sure how long I lay there, wide awake, listening. The sounds outside had stopped for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally got out of bed, heart racing, and made my way downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shone it out the window toward the gravel path that led up to the cabin. The beam of light flickered, catching nothing but the empty path and the shadows of trees. I stood there for a moment, breath caught in my throat, unsure of what I was looking for. There was nothing, but that didn't feel reassuring. It made the whole situation worse. The longer I stood there, the more I became convinced that I had imagined it all. The footsteps were just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and went back to bed, determined to get some sleep. But I didn't fall asleep right away. My mind raced, thinking about the strange feeling that had settled over me. I had never been the paranoid type, but this place, it felt different. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt like something was off. The isolation, the quiet, the way the cabin sat alone in the woods. It all felt a little too perfect, a little too still. Sleep finally came, but it was fitful. I tossed and turned all night, waking every few hours to the sound of the wind howling outside, or was it something else? I couldn't tell anymore. When morning came, the sun barely broke through the clouds. It was still cold outside, but the forest around the cabin seemed peaceful, untouched. I thought maybe I was just overthinking things. I had come here to relax after all. I decided to go for a walk, hoping to clear my head. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed some water, and stepped outside. The crisp air hit me immediately, and I breathed it in, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. The gravel path leading away from the cabin was lined with thick trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I started walking, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound for miles. It was calming at first, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more I noticed something strange. The absence of any wildlife. No birds chirped in the trees, no squirrels scampered across the ground. The silence felt unnatural. It was like everything had gone still, waiting for something. I continued walking, my steps growing heavier with each passing minute. And then I saw it. A small clearing in the woods, where the trees had been cut down. But it wasn't the clearing that caught my eye. It was what was in the center of it. A pile of rocks, arranged in a perfect circle. I stopped, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't natural. It looked like something had intentionally placed those rocks in that pattern. But who would do that here, in the middle of nowhere? I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't right. Something about the place, the way it was so quiet, so empty, made me feel like I wasn't alone. Like someone or something was watching me. I quickly turned around and hurried back to the cabin, my pace quickening as the thoughts in my head grew darker. My breath came faster as I neared the cabin, the trees around me feeling more oppressive with every step. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, or why I felt so on edge, but one thing was clear. I needed to leave. I spent the rest of the day packing my things, getting ready to head back home. As I walked through the cabin, making sure I hadn't left anything behind, I heard a noise from the woods, a faint crackling of branches. I froze, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps again. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was the empty, silent forest. I left that cabin behind, never looking back. Whatever had been out there, whatever strange presence had lingered, It wasn't something I wanted to understand. Some things are best left alone, hidden in the quiet corners of the world. I'll never go back to that cabin, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in the dead of night. I had always looked forward to the idea of a quiet weekend getaway in a remote cabin. My life had been chaotic for months. Work was stressful, and I hadn't spent much time with nature in years. So when I found a secluded cabin by a lake in the woods, I thought it would be the perfect escape. It was an old place, nothing fancy, but it looked charming online. The pictures showed a rustic cabin with a big front porch, surrounded by trees and nestled against a small, calm lake. It seemed like the perfect place to reset. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive. The last part of the road was dirt and gravel, winding up through the woods. I could feel the change in the air, cool and crisp, with the scent of pine. The cabin itself was a little older than I had expected, but it was still sturdy. A wooden deck wrapped around the front, and the steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up to the door. Inside, the cabin had a welcoming, if a little musty, smell. The floors were hardwood, creaky in places, but it added to the charm. The furniture was simple: an old couch, a coffee table, a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. But everything was clean enough and it felt cozy. I set down my bags and explored a bit before deciding to settle in. The place was isolated, with no neighbors in sight. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional bird call. It felt peaceful, too peaceful, in fact. It was a stark contrast to the noise of my city life, and for the first time in months, I felt myself start to relax. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, looking out over the lake as the sun started to set. It was beautiful, serene even, but there was something about the stillness that felt too still, as if the world around me was holding its breath. That night, the temperature dropped quickly, and I could hear the wind picking up in the trees. I made a fire in the stove and settled in for a quiet evening. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional gust of wind outside. I went to bed early, planning to wake up at dawn for a long hike around the area. The bed was comfortable, and the blankets were warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It was nothing specific, just a subtle sensation that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the silence or the fact that the cabin was so isolated. I kept hearing small noises, creaks in the walls, the wind howling outside, a branch tapping against the window, but nothing that could explain the feeling gnawing at me. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding, and I felt disoriented. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of embers in the stove. I sat up, listening. The wind had died down, and everything was unnervingly still. I could hear my own breath, the beating of my heart in my ears. Then, a noise, a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped, came from the direction of the front door. I froze, straining to listen. The noise didn't come again. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, the wind shifting, but my instincts were telling me otherwise. I got up cautiously, making my way to the door. I felt ridiculous, but I had to check. Nothing. The door was still locked, and no sign of anything out of place. But my nerves were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed awake for a while, eyes wide in the dark, listening for any more sounds, but it was silent again. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell back into a fitful sleep. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I went for the hike I had planned, walking along a trail that looped around the lake. The air was fresh, and the sounds of the forest were calming. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional squirrel scampered across the path. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be following me. But there was nothing there, just trees, rocks, and the occasional flash of movement in the underbrush. By the time I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, I was exhausted. I decided to make a late lunch and relax. But as I unpacked my backpack, I noticed something strange. My water bottle, which I had definitely filled before heading out, was nearly empty. It didn't make sense. I'd only been gone a couple of hours, and I hadn't drunk that much water. But the bottle was almost entirely gone. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had drunk more than I thought. Still, it felt odd. My sense of unease was growing. I went to the window, looking out over the porch and the surrounding area. The woods were quiet, but there was something off about the place. Something I couldn't pinpoint. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, double-checking everything before heading to bed. The house creaked in the wind, and the fire in the stove crackled softly. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, soft scratching sounds, like something small moving across the floor. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Just shadows in the corners and the flickering light of the fire. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a soft thud at the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone, heading to the front door. My heart was racing as I approached, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was scared, really scared. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dust outside. It was like the sound had come from nowhere. I locked the door again and went back to bed. But this time, I didn't feel like I was safe. The cabin felt more like a trap, and I had this overwhelming feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I was determined to leave. I had had enough. I didn't care if the weekend was only halfway over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But as I packed up my things, I found something strange. There, on the kitchen table, was my water bottle. It had been placed there while I was out. It wasn't there when I left, and I hadn't brought it inside after my hike. But somehow it was sitting on the table, the cap twisted tightly on it. I left that afternoon. The drive back felt like a relief, the tension in my chest easing with each mile. I didn't stop until I was home, where I could finally breathe again. It wasn't until I got back to my apartment that I realized something else. I never heard another noise after that last thud at the door. Not a single sound from the woods. Not even the wind. I don't know what it was. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me, maybe the isolation got to me. But I'm never going back to that cabin again. That feeling, that sense of being watched, never quite left me. I can still picture the empty porch, the silence of the woods around it, and the strange noises in the dark. Felt real, too real. But what I know now is that it was a place where I didn't belong, a place that had its own secrets, and I was lucky to get out in one piece. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a getaway in a small, remote cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the noise of the city and the endless distractions of everyday life. My friend, Ben, and I had been talking about doing this for months, planning every little detail. A quiet retreat, no internet, no phone signal, just the wilderness, some good food, and plenty of time to unwind. The cabin was a small, weathered place, sitting on the edge of a dense forest in the mountains. The kind of cabin you'd imagine in old survival stories. The kind where the wood creaks and the floorboards make a soft groaning sound whenever you step on them. It was perfect for what we were looking for. Simple, isolated, and far from anyone. When we arrived, the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It had rained a little earlier, and everything had that fresh, clean scent. The sky was gray and overcast, which made the place feel even more isolated, as though it had been forgotten by time. There was a small dirt path leading up to the cabin, and I noticed that the place hadn't seen much traffic. The grass had overgrown a bit, and the front porch had a slight lean to it. Ben had driven, and I was the one who carried in most of the gear. We had packed light, just a few bags, some supplies, and a couple of coolers with food. Inside, the cabin was just as rustic as the outside. There was a small stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a simple wooden table. The windows were small, with heavy curtains that blocked most of the daylight. Felt like it belonged to another time. After we unloaded everything, we set up, and I started a fire in the hearth. The crackling sound of the flames was comforting, and I could feel the warmth of the fire spreading through the room. Ben was busy making sandwiches, and I let myself relax for a moment, taking in the stillness of the place. As night fell, the sky outside darkened, and the cabin grew colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and stoked the fire. There was something about the quiet of the forest at night, the way the wind rustled the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig breaking in the distance, the hum of insects, that made me feel a little uneasy. But I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. We ate our dinner in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Afterward, we sat back and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. The firewood crackled, and every now and then, we'd hear the distant call of a coyote or the soft rustle of something moving through the trees. It was peaceful, but there was something about the stillness that seemed a little off. As the hours stretched on, we finally decided to turn in. The beds were simple, just mattresses on wooden frames with thick blankets. I could hear the wind picking up outside and the occasional rattle of the cabin's window panes. I lay there in the dark, trying to settle into sleep, but my mind kept wandering. I don't know how long I lay awake, but it must have been well past midnight when I finally heard it, a soft knock. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin was old, and the walls had their creaks and groans. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate knock, as if someone was gently tapping on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 distinct taps, spaced out, as if whoever it was waiting for an answer. I slid out of bed slowly, careful not to wake Ben. My feet hit the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. I stood in the dark, listening intently. The knock came again, and this time it sounded much closer, almost as if it was right outside my window. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no one out there, I told myself. It had to be the wind or an animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too intentional to be anything like that. I tiptoed over to the window, slowly pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the forest was black, a thick sea of shadows. The only light came from the faint glow of the fire inside the cabin. There was nothing there, no one standing by the door, just the dark, endless trees. I pulled the curtain back, breathing a little easier, but I still felt unsettled. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't want to wake Ben. He'd just laugh it off as nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew what I'd heard. I forced myself to sit back down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old cabin in the woods. The wind could make all sorts of strange sounds, right? The next morning, I didn't say anything to Ben. I didn't want to sound crazy, and part of me was hoping it had just been a dream. But as we went about our day, gathering firewood, cooking breakfast, and exploring the surrounding woods, the unease didn't go away. If anything, it grew. That night, after another quiet dinner, we sat by the fire, both of us silently lost in our own thoughts. The knock hadn't happened again, but I kept hearing strange sounds coming from the woods outside. It was like something was moving just beyond the edge of the trees, too far to see but close enough to hear. The branches scraping against each other, the crunch of leaves. It made my skin crawl. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel afraid. The calm, serene cabin I had imagined had turned into something oppressive. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Ben seemed oblivious to my growing anxiety. He was completely at ease, enjoying the isolation. I couldn't bring myself to tell him about the knocks. I was afraid he'd dismiss it or worse, mock me, so I kept my thoughts to myself. That night, as we prepared for bed, I decided to stay awake a little longer, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window, listening. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant crash of a branch breaking or something large moving in the forest. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a bear. Then the knock came again. It was unmistakable, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came from the back of the cabin this time, where the trees were thickest. I couldn't see anything out there, just the shadowy outline of the forest pressing against the cabin. I didn't dare open the door. I stayed in the dark, frozen, staring out the window, listening. The knocks came again, this time closer, as if someone was standing right outside. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to wake Ben, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself again, but that didn't explain the deliberate knocks. I waited in the dark, every muscle in my body tense, until I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. Heavy, slow steps, the kind of steps you'd hear from a person, not an animal. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy log from the fireplace, and backed away from the window. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. I had no idea what was out there, but I wasn't about to let whatever it was get any closer. The footsteps stopped. Everything was silent again. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. No wind, no rustling of leaves. Just the quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, making your ears ring. After what felt like hours, I couldn't stand it any longer. I crept back to the window, cautiously pulling aside the curtain once more. Nothing. The forest was still. The only movement was the shifting of the trees in the wind. I let out a long, shaky breath. Whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. The silence was almost worse than the sounds. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't sleep much, but I forced myself to stay in the bed, not daring to move again until morning. In the morning, I told Ben what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, of course. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear or something like that. He didn't understand how real the fear had felt. I wasn't about to go out there and search for whatever had been lurking around the cabin. I didn't care if it was an animal or a person. I wasn't going to risk it. We packed up that morning. I didn't want to stay another night. Even Ben seemed a little uneasy. He kept looking out at the woods, and there was an edge to his voice when he spoke. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The whole experience had left a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't just the knocks or the footsteps. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went over every detail in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made. It had happened. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't need to. I haven't been back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there that night, but I don't think I ever want to find out. I needed to get away, not for some dramatic reason like heartbreak or some traumatic loss, but just because everything felt noisy. My phone never stopped buzzing. My apartment was always crowded with street noise, and every day felt like it repeated the last. So when a coworker mentioned an old hunting cabin he owned but didn't use anymore, I jumped on it. He gave me the keys and directions scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. He said it was about 20 miles off the main road, out in the woods behind a gas station that closed down 3 years ago. He hadn't been there in a while, but everything should still be in good enough condition to get by. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. That was the part that sold me. I packed enough food and water for 10 days. I brought some tools, a generator, gas cans, a rifle he loaned me, just in case, and a few books to keep my mind occupied. I planned to hike, read, sleep, and forget the rest of the world existed. I told 2 people where I was going and gave them the rough GPS coordinates. That was it. The drive out there was uneventful until I hit the last stretch. The paved road turned into a dirt trail, and that trail twisted through a dense forest that got darker the deeper I went. After a few miles, I passed an old rusted gate hanging half off its hinges. The sign on it was too faded to read, but it was the one mentioned in the directions. From there, I followed tire tracks until I reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The structure looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The porch sagged a little, one shutter was hanging by a single hinge, and moss had taken over the north wall. But the roof looked solid, the windows were intact, and the door opened just fine. Inside, it smelled like old wood, dust, and dried pine. There were 2 rooms. The front room had a table, 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove with a stack of firewood beside it. The back room had a cot with a thin mattress and a little nightstand. Everything else was bare. No electricity unless I used the generator. No plumbing beyond a rain barrel and an outhouse 30 yards away. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first 2 days were calm. I settled in, chopped some firewood, went on short hikes around the area, and cooked on the old stove. I kept the generator off unless I needed to charge my flashlight or boil water with a little electric kettle I brought. Most of the time I just read, listened to the sounds of the woods, or walked in circles trying to spot deer or bears. I never saw anything bigger than a squirrel. The third night, I woke up around 2 in the morning because of a sound. It wasn't loud, just sudden, like something thumped against the wall of the cabin. I sat still for a while, listening. Nothing else came after that. I assumed maybe a branch fell or an animal brushed against the side. I got up to check, but when I stepped out with the flashlight, everything looked untouched. The woods were quiet. No wind, no movement, just a weird silence. I went back inside and sat on the cot, staring at the door for a while. Then I told myself I was being stupid and went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if there were any signs of what I'd heard. I found nothing. No scuff marks, no tracks, nothing out of place. But still, it had felt strange. That silence the night before was different. Not peaceful, but thick, like everything had stopped moving. Later that day, I hiked a little farther than usual, heading west from the clearing. About a mile out, I found an old path. It was overgrown, but still walkable. I followed it out of curiosity. After about 20 minutes, I saw a small campsite. It looked abandoned. There was a half-collapsed tent, a burned-out fire ring, and some torn canvas laid across the ground. At first, I figured it was just an old hunting site that someone forgot about. But then I noticed the clothesline. There were socks and a t-shirt still clipped to it. Faded, but not rotted. That meant someone had been there within the last year or so, maybe less. I walked around the area and spotted a rusted knife stuck in a tree stump. Inside the tent, I found an old blanket, a torn backpack, and a broken phone with no battery. The odd part was that it didn't look like someone packed up and left. More like someone left in a hurry or never came back. I felt uneasy and decided not to stay too long. I hiked back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder more often than usual. That night, I locked the door and propped a chair under the knob. I knew how paranoid that sounded, but something about that abandoned camp put me on edge. I didn't even try to read. I just sat by the stove and kept the lantern on until I couldn't stay awake anymore. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They were faint, but there. One set, near the porch. I hadn't walked there the day before. I was sure of it. And they weren't mine. The tread didn't match my boots. Whoever it was had smaller feet, narrower too. They led up to the steps and then just stopped. No prints leading away. That made no sense. The ground was soft enough that all prints should have been visible, especially with the dew that morning. I spent the rest of that day checking the tree line in every direction. I didn't find anyone. No signs of movement, no voices, nothing. I told myself maybe it was an old footprint that somehow held up, even though the weather had been damp. Still, I didn't feel comfortable anymore. I kept the rifle close the next night. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made my body tense up. Branches cracking, leaves rustling. It could have been animals. Sure, but I didn't believe that anymore. On the 5th day, I decided to leave the cabin during daylight and hike back to the overgrown trail to see if anything had changed at the old campsite. I felt like I had to know. The place looked the same as before, but now I noticed a small metal tin under a log. I opened it. Inside were a few scraps of paper. Most were ruined from moisture, but one was still legible. It had a list of dates, 10 of them. Next to each was a word: arrived, checked, saw, left. The last date had no word next to it, just a blank space. The last date was from 6 weeks ago. I sat there staring at it, and for the first time I felt real fear. It wasn't dramatic or like something from a movie. It was cold and low, sitting deep in my stomach. I left the tin there and backed away, slowly. As I walked back to the cabin, I had the feeling that someone was watching me. The woods felt too quiet again, like they had before. Not peaceful, just empty and wrong. I stopped a few times and listened. I even turned around suddenly a few times, hoping to catch movement, but nothing. Still, I didn't shake the feeling. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed by the stove with the rifle on my lap, staring at the door. The lantern hissed faintly beside me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't trying to be quiet, crunching slowly across the leaves, moving toward the cabin. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears. After a full minute of silence, the doorknob rattled. Just once, then again. Not like someone trying to open it with force, but more like someone testing to see if it was locked. I didn't move. I aimed the rifle at the door and waited. After a few seconds, it stopped. No footsteps walked away. I waited another 10 minutes, then stood slowly and turned off the lantern. I went to the window and peeked out. It was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something was still out there. I didn't sleep until the sun rose. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how remote it was. I didn't care about the peaceful escape anymore. I packed everything I could carry, strapped on the rifle, and locked the door behind me. The problem was my truck wouldn't start. I tried it 3 times. Nothing. The battery wasn't dead. The lights came on, but the engine didn't even try to turn over. I popped the hood and checked the cables. The battery cable had been cut. Clean. With a knife or blade, not chewed, not frayed, just sliced. That was it for me. I grabbed my bag and started walking. I had a general idea of the direction I needed to go to get back to the road. I figured I'd make it by nightfall if I kept a steady pace. I stayed on the dirt path as long as I could before it narrowed and disappeared into brush. At some point, I started hearing footsteps behind me. Not constant, but every so often. Just enough to let me know someone was back there. I didn't run. I didn't want to show fear or lose control. I just kept walking. By early evening, I made it to the main road. I never felt relief like that before in my life. As soon as I saw the pavement, I felt my knees go weak. I followed it until I saw a roadside maintenance shed and waited there until a passing car stopped to help. I didn't tell the driver everything, just said my truck broke down out in the woods and I needed to get to town. He didn't ask questions. He dropped me at a gas station, and from there I called someone I trusted to pick me up. Later that week, I had my coworker tow the truck out of there. When he got back, he said someone had smashed the I needed to get away. Work was killing me. Sitting at a desk for 12 hours a day, grinding through endless emails, back-to-back video calls, and a boss who somehow thought being burned out was a sign of commitment. It was too much. I had to shut everything off. No phone, no laptop, no Wi-Fi. Just trees, sky, and quiet. So I rented a cabin about 100 miles out from the city, deep in a forest preserve that stretched for miles in every direction. It was one of those old logging cabins, all wood, no insulation, creaky floors, the kind of place people used in the 70s before tourism changed what remote meant. I found it through a local forum where someone posted a listing with just a couple of pictures. No frills. 1 room with stove, twin bed, outhouse 30 feet away, and a small well pump behind the place. You had to bring your own food, own bedding, and your own firewood unless you wanted to chop it yourself. That's what I wanted: isolation. No one around for miles. No service. Nothing to pull me back into the world. The drive out took longer than expected. The last hour was on a dirt road with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. There were no signs, no addresses, just a hand-drawn map and vague landmarks like the dead tree that splits in two and rock pile shaped like a bear. I didn't pass a single other car after turning off the main road. No lights, no fences, no power lines. Just forest, thick and green. When I finally pulled up, I was exhausted but relieved. The cabin looked just like in the photos, small, square, with moss growing on the roof shingles and a sagging porch out front. The door creaked as I opened it. The floor smelled like old wood and ash. There was a stove in the corner, a cot on one side with a thin mattress, a small table, and a couple of wooden chairs. A row of hooks on the wall for hanging coats or lanterns, and a single tiny window looking out toward the trees. It was perfect. I unloaded my supplies. Canned food, water jugs, a sleeping bag, flashlight, a hunting knife I mostly carried for peace of mind, and a small solar battery pack just in case. I stacked my firewood near the stove, laid out my bedding, and stretched my legs on the porch while the sun dipped low behind the pines. The quiet was incredible. Not city quiet. I mean real quiet, where the only sound is wind moving through leaves and birds settling into their nests. No buzzing lights, no engines, no voices. Took a while for my brain to stop searching for noise. That first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a can of beans, and read from a paperback until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I slept deeper than I had in months. No dreams. No waking up to notifications or headlights flashing through blinds. Just sleep. The next morning, I boiled water for coffee and sat on the porch again, staring at nothing. It was the first time I truly felt disconnected in years. I explored a little, hiking around the back of the cabin, following a faint trail down toward a small creek. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer mostly, maybe a raccoon or two. I spotted a couple of old beer cans buried under leaves, probably from hunters or someone who used the place years ago, but no real signs of people. That's how I liked it. I spent the afternoon chopping some extra firewood, stacking it near the porch. My arms ached, and I sweat more than I expected. I felt alive. As the sky turned purple, I went inside and warmed up dinner. Another can of beans. I made a note to bring better food next time. That night was different. I went to bed around 9 o'clock, letting the fire die down. The cot wasn't comfortable, but I was too tired to care. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up to a sound. Faint, distant, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. A soft thud, then nothing. At first, I figured it was a branch falling or maybe a deer kicking something over, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay still for a while, staring into the dark, listening. Then I heard something again, this time closer, like something brushing against the wall of the cabin. A soft scrape, almost like fabric or fur dragging across wood. I held my breath, then nothing again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around or a raccoon. I'd left no food outside. Nothing should have drawn them, but my mind started spinning anyway. I sat up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. I scanned the room. Everything looked exactly how I left it. I got up, moved toward the door, and opened it as quietly as I could. The forest outside was pitch black. The flashlight barely reached 10 feet beyond the porch. The woods just swallowed the light. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything either, just the low groan of the trees in the wind. I closed the door, bolted it, and sat awake for at least an hour, but nothing else happened. I woke late the next morning, groggy and stiff. I stepped outside to splash water on my face, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not animal prints. Shoes, boots probably, medium-sized, at least 2 different sets, judging by the depth and angle. They weren't there the day before. My stomach dropped. I walked around the cabin slowly, looking for more. The prints circled halfway around and disappeared into the trees. They didn't come from the road. They came from deeper in the woods. I felt watched. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe some hikers passed through. Maybe hunters. Still, this was private land. According to the guy who rented it to me, there shouldn't be anyone for miles. No trails, no camps, no buildings. Just forest. I couldn't shake the idea that someone had come to the cabin and stood right outside in the middle of the night. I kept the knife in my belt the rest of the day. That afternoon, I walked further down the old trail past the creek, trying to see if maybe there was a camp nearby. I didn't find anything. No tents, no trash, no sounds. Just woods. But about 200 yards in, I noticed something weird. A pile of rocks stacked in a neat little cone, about 2 feet tall. At first I thought it was just natural, but it was too clean, too deliberate. like someone had taken the time to stack them by hand. I knocked it over and kept walking. That night, I locked the door and kept the flashlight and knife beside my bed. I barely slept. The sounds came again, a little louder this time. Something rustling leaves just outside. Then silence. Then what sounded like wood tapping against something, maybe the porch railing. I didn't dare open the door. I just lay still in the dark, heart pounding, counting each breath. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I stepped outside again. More footprints, more than before. This time they were deeper, pressed into the soft earth like someone had been standing in one spot for a while. One print was right up against the porch steps, less than 6 feet from where I slept. I was done pretending this was just hikers. Something was wrong. I packed up my gear, shoved everything back into my car, and planned to drive out. But when I turned the key, the engine just clicked. Battery was dead, which didn't make sense. I hadn't left anything on. I popped the hood and checked the connections. Nothing was loose. Nothing looked drained. It was just dead. Completely. I tried not to panic. There was no cell service, no satellite phone, no radio. The nearest town was over 10 miles back down the road. A full day's hike if I pushed. But something told me that whoever had been coming around at night might not want me walking out. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't know if they were watching, but I knew I wasn't safe staying there another night. I spent the day barricading the door with furniture. I nailed a few boards from the back porch across the window. I kept the fire low to avoid light leaking out. I ate cold beans from the can, barely tasting them. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and the knife in my hand, waiting. That night I heard voices. Not words, just low sounds like murmurs. Not loud but close, maybe a few feet from the door. Then slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. One after the other. Then nothing. Hours passed. Just before sunrise, I heard movement again. Something metallic dragging across wood. I waited until full daylight before opening the door. On the porch was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, the hunting knife I'd left next to my bed. I hadn't even noticed it was gone. That broke me. I didn't care about the car. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water and food, and started walking down the road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Every now and then I'd hear a branch crack in the trees behind me. I didn't run. I just kept walking. It took me 6 hours to reach a ranger station just outside the preserve. When I got there, I could barely speak. They asked what happened. I told them someone had been stalking me in the woods, that they stole from me, watched me sleep, maybe more than one. I told them I found footprints and heard sounds every night. They looked at me like they'd heard it before. They said they'd check it out. Weeks passed. I took the job because I needed the money. I had no backup plan, no other real option. I was months behind on rent, trying to climb out of debt after losing my old job at a construction site when the company went under. This new job was with a private land management company that maintained large tracts of remote forest in the upper Midwest, some old conservation lands, others used for sustainable logging. The pay wasn't great, but it came with housing, and I'd be working alone in the woods, surveying the land and cataloging erosion patterns, trail conditions, tree growth, wildlife signs, basic fieldwork stuff I already knew how to do. The housing was a cabin. They called it a field station. It was old, about 30 years at least, tucked miles deep into a forest reserve that was closed to the public. There was one gravel road in and out, nearly 12 miles long, and it was barely maintained. The place had a generator, no running water, and an old propane tank for heating and cooking. The cabin sat in a flat clearing surrounded by old pine and birch. I saw it for the first time late in the afternoon on my first day, after driving in from the main office, which was nearly 2 hours away. The moment I parked my truck and stepped out, I felt something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. I know that sounds like a cliche, but this was a different kind of quiet. I'd been in the woods plenty of times. I camped alone when I was younger. I used to like the stillness, but this wasn't that kind of stillness. This was the kind where it felt like everything was holding its breath, like the forest itself was waiting for something. I figured it was just nerves, I unloaded my gear, walked around the cabin to check it out. The place was solid. The porch steps creaked and some boards were warped with age, but the roof looked good, and the windows had storm shutters. There was a narrow footpath leading into the woods on the west side of the clearing, marked by faded orange tape wrapped around a few trees. That was one of the survey trails I'd be using. Inside the cabin, there was a single main room, a tiny kitchen area, a wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, and a small desk by the window. A metal cabinet held old survey maps, field guides, and logbooks going back at least 10 years. There were also 2 trail cameras and a broken GPS unit. Everything smelled like dust, wood smoke, and old pine needles. That first night was calm. I cooked canned chili on the propane stove, made a fire in the wood stove, and read through the previous field notes. Nothing stood out. Most of it was boring. Notes about stream flow, tree damage, weather patterns. One thing I noticed, though, was that for the past 3 years, the same person had worked this section of the forest, someone named Mitch. His handwriting was neat and clipped. His entries were consistent and thorough, but the last few pages of his logbook looked different. They were shorter. The last entry just said, * Eastern Ridge Trail unusable. Collapsed section. No signs of bear activity. We'll check again after rain. * No date. No signature. Just that. Felt unfinished. I checked the cover. He had logged entries almost every week up until that one. After that, nothing. The company rep who handed me the keys never mentioned Mitch. Maybe he quit. Maybe he transferred. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. The first week went by slow. Every day, I hiked sections of trail, marked erosion spots, took pictures, checked soil samples. Most of it was routine, but I started to feel uneasy about 3 days in. At first, it was just the sense of being watched. Again, it sounds stupid, but I'd walk a trail and suddenly stop, turn around, feeling like something had moved just out of view. A shape, a noise, the kind of thing that makes the hairs on your neck go up even though nothing's there. It didn't happen all the time, just little moments, once while crouching near a stream to test water pH, once while walking back toward the cabin at dusk, and once in the middle of a trail near the northern border of the land, where the trees got weirdly close together and the sunlight barely got through. I started keeping track of when it happened. I made a note every time I felt that tension. I also started noticing that the wildlife was scarce. No deer, no rabbits, not even squirrels. In 5 full days walking the forest, I didn't hear a single woodpecker or see a hawk. Once, I found a trail of fresh deer tracks near the western creek, but they just stopped in the middle of a muddy patch, like the animal had disappeared. I followed the prints back the way they came and found deep scratches on a tree trunk, about 6 feet up. No bear tracks, no claw marks below, just deep slashes in the bark. That night, I stayed up late by the fire. I read back through more of Mitch's old notes. One entry from the year before stood out. Said * Southern Trail, something off. Found boot prints too wide to be human. Not logged. Will revisit with camera. * But the camera logs were empty. I looked through the old digital files on the backup hard drive in the cabinet. Nothing labeled. Most were blurry images of trees, raccoons, night deer. Nothing unusual. The second week was worse. One morning, I stepped outside and found a pile of rocks stacked neatly near the porch. 5 flat stones arranged like a little cairn. I hadn't put them there. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been from a previous worker. But when I knocked it over out of curiosity, the next day there was another one. Same place, same size. I didn't hear anything during the night. No footsteps, no crunching leaves, nothing. Then the knocking started. The cabin was old, and I expected creaks and groans. But these weren't those kinds of sounds. These were 3 solid knocks, deliberate, slow, spaced out. The first time, it was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, not sleeping. The knocks came from the far side of the cabin, near the back wall. I sat up, waited, listened. Nothing after that. I thought maybe it was a tree branch in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The next night, it was the front wall, closer this time. Again, 3 knocks, same spacing. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. Nothing there. No tracks, no animals. I even walked the perimeter of the clearing. I couldn't find anything. But when I came back in, I noticed the front door latch wasn't sitting flush anymore, like someone had tugged on it hard and bent the bolt. I hadn't seen that before. I stopped sleeping after that. I dozed for 20 minutes at a time, but I kept waking up in a sweat, thinking I'd heard something. I locked the door. I propped a chair under the handle. I even kept my old hunting knife next to the bed. I hadn't used it in years. By the third week, I was losing track of time. I still forced myself to do the survey work. I logged notes, took pictures, checked trail markers, but I avoided the Eastern Ridge Trail. Something about that area felt wrong. The trees were older there, taller, and more twisted. The undergrowth was too dense. The path faded halfway up the incline, and the dirt looked like it had been disturbed. Not eroded, just shifted, like something big had moved through and pressed everything flat. There were broken branches 10 feet off the ground. I couldn't explain it. Then, one afternoon, I found something. It was on the far south side, near the edge of the property. I was walking a side trail I hadn't used before. Barely a trail, really, just a faint line through the brush. It ended at a small depression in the ground, like an old fire pit. And in that pit, I found bones. Burned bones. A mix of deer and something else. The skull was shattered, and the ribs looked human. I'm not a biologist, but I know what a human ribcage looks like. These were small, like from a young adult or teenager. I didn't touch them. I just stared for a while, then slowly backed away and marked the coordinates on my notepad. Back at the cabin, I pulled out the sat phone the company gave me. It was old and barely held a charge, but I got a weak signal and called the office. No one picked up. I left a message, said I needed to speak to someone about something I'd found. I didn't mention bones, just said it was urgent. No one called back. The next day, the trail cameras were gone. I had mounted one by the Western Creek and one by the path near the South Trail. Both had been ripped off their trees. One had been smashed, the casing shattered, the lens cracked. The other was just gone. No trace. I found drag marks in the dirt, like something had pulled it away. I didn't go back out after that. The last night, everything fell apart. I was packing up. I didn't care about the contract or the money anymore. I just wanted out. I had my gear stacked by the door and was waiting for morning to start the drive back out. Around 2 a.m., the generator cut out. Everything went dark. I got up to check it, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The woods were dead silent again. No wind, no insects, no frogs, just stillness. Then I saw it. Across the clearing, just at the edge where the trees began, something was standing. It was tall, too tall. At first, I thought it was a tree, but then it moved, just a little, a shift of weight, a tilt of the head. Couldn't see a face, just a long, thin shape, maybe. I had always preferred the solitude of nature. There was something about the stillness of the woods that gave me peace. I had spent countless weekends hiking, camping, and occasionally renting cabins to escape the noise of the world. But this trip, this cabin in the middle of nowhere, was different. I wasn't sure what had drawn me to it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place was off. Maybe it was the location itself, so far from any towns, or maybe it was the strange look the cabin had when I first saw it from the distance, half hidden behind thick trees. It was a small cabin, no more than a single room with a loft. I was expecting something simple, but this one felt older than anything I had ever stayed in before. The wood was weathered, the windows were clouded with age, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. But despite the discomfort that settled in my gut, I tried to ignore it. I'd come for peace and quiet, to get away from everything, and I wasn't going to let a little unease ruin my time. I settled my gear into the corner, unpacking the few necessities I'd brought. Food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and my first aid kit. The cabin had an old-fashioned wood stove in the corner, and I decided to fire it up to warm the place. The chill of the evening air was starting to creep into the room. The fire crackled to life, its warmth slowly filling the small space. I stepped outside for a moment to gather some firewood. making sure to keep the cabin in sight. The sun was already dipping low behind the trees when I began to chop the firewood, the sharp crack of the axe cutting through the stillness. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. There wasn't much wind, and the trees around me seemed almost unnervingly quiet. I couldn't hear birds or animals, not even a rustle of leaves. It was like the whole world had gone still. The light was almost gone by the time I had gathered enough wood, so I headed back to the cabin. When I stepped inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around me like a blanket. I made a quick dinner, just a simple canned soup, and sat down to eat. As I ate, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There were no sounds of insects or wind outside, just absolute silence. I figured it was just the remoteness of the place, but that silence began to feel unnatural. I finished my meal and decided to head to bed, not wanting to spend the night sitting around a fire alone in this strange place. As I settled under the covers, the cabin creaked, the walls groaning with age. It was the kind of sound I had come to expect from older buildings, but tonight it was different. I was just beginning to drift off to sleep when I heard something, a thud. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the noise came again, this time louder. It was coming from outside the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. The last thing I wanted was to think I was being watched or followed, but the silence had been so absolute earlier. How could something be out there without me noticing? I lay still, listening. The wind was picking up now, rustling the branches in the trees. Another thud, closer this time. My eyes darted toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything. My thoughts raced. Was it an animal? A bear? Person? I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and slowly stood up. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved toward the door. There was no point in hiding from whatever it was. I had to check it out. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the pitch-black night. The air outside felt colder, the silence even heavier. I stepped out onto the porch, trying to keep my breathing steady. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing but trees. My breath came out in visible puffs as I scanned the area, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I felt exposed standing there, the beam of light quivering in my hand. Another thud, closer, unmistakable now. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving in the brush. I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The sound was coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. There was no moon to give me light, only the weak beam of the flashlight. I moved slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. As I reached the tree line, I heard something behind me, a branch snapping. I spun around, my flashlight aimed at the sound, but it was just the wind, I told myself. There was no one there. I looked back toward the woods, but the flashlight beam cut through empty air. The thudding continued, now coming from directly ahead. I pushed forward, my footsteps more deliberate. I had to know what was out there, what had made that noise. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal, though the thuds sounded too purposeful, too rhythmic. I stepped deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker, the darkness swallowing the light from the flashlight. It felt like the night was closing in around me. The woods were unnaturally quiet now, the thudding suddenly stopping. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with possible explanations. Then something moved, something big, rustling through the underbrush. I froze, the light of the flashlight shaking as I tried to see what it was. I couldn't make it out, but I knew something was there. I backed up slowly, my eyes scanning every shadow in the woods, listening intently. The thudding resumed, now coming from all around me. I wasn't sure if I was surrounded or if it was just my mind playing tricks. I knew I had to get back to the cabin. I turned and started running, my heart thumping in my chest, but every step I took felt like it was too slow. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, but the noise of the thudding followed me, growing louder, more frantic. The sound wasn't coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from the cabin. I reached the porch, almost stumbling as I reached for the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I fumbled with the handle, panic setting in. I banged on the door, calling for help, but I knew I was alone. The pounding in my chest grew louder than the thudding outside. I could feel the heat of the fire through the walls, but I couldn't get inside. I glanced around frantically, the sound of footsteps coming closer. I heard the rustling of something large moving towards me, but I couldn't see it. My breath came in shallow bursts as I backed away from the door. I grabbed a stick from the porch, holding it in front of me like some kind of weapon, though I knew it was useless. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice. Low, gruff, almost a whisper. "You're not alone." I froze, my body going stiff. The voice wasn't anyone I knew, but it was unmistakably human. I tried to make out the words, but they came again, this time more clearly. "You should have never come here." I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling on the porch steps. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone, was out there, watching me. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. I turned, finally managing to pull open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against it, my mind racing as I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. My flashlight was still clutched tightly in my hand, but the beam was weak now, flickering in the dark. I tried to calm my breathing, but it was impossible. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaking. Something was out there. Someone was watching me. I knew it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. The thudding, the whispering, it all ceased. The woods were quiet again, unnervingly so. I stood there for what felt like hours, not daring to move, not sure if I was still in danger or if my mind had just played tricks on me. Eventually, the morning light began to filter through the small cabin window. The storm that had been brewing all night was finally quieting. The world outside seemed so normal, so still. But as I looked out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I stayed in the cabin the entire day, never venturing out again. I left that evening, abandoning the cabin without a second thought. The road back to civilization felt like the longest journey I'd ever made, and I never went near that cabin again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. All I know is that something was watching me, something that didn't want me to stay. But whatever it was, I never looked back. I had been needing a break for a while. City life had drained me completely. The noise, the screens, the people, the traffic. It was too much. I had gone years without a proper vacation. I just wanted to be alone somewhere quiet, where I could sleep as long as I wanted and not hear anything but wind and birds. I looked online and found a listing for a small off-grid cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors for miles. Just trees, a lake nearby, and silence. The pictures looked perfect. Wooden walls, a small porch, a fire pit out front. It had solar panels for electricity, a wood-burning stove for heat, and a big tank of clean water. There was even a little loft area with a bed under a skylight. It looked cozy and untouched. The owners only rented it to low-maintenance solo travelers, and they required a signed agreement saying I wouldn't expect help or check-ins. That was fine with me. It was exactly what I wanted. I booked it for a full week in October, right when the leaves would be changing. I packed my truck with groceries, a cooler, extra firewood, and a few books. I brought a rifle just to be safe. Not that I planned to use it, but the listing had mentioned bears sometimes passing through. I also brought a paper map in case GPS didn't work out there. The drive took most of a day. I left the highway and spent a couple of hours weaving through dirt roads until even those disappeared. The final stretch was a narrow trail barely wide enough for my truck, branches scraping the sides. When I finally saw the cabin, the sun was low, orange light spilling through the trees. It was even more isolated than I thought. Completely silent. Not a single plane in the sky, not even a squirrel in sight. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the calm. I walked the property a bit, got used to the layout. It was a one-room cabin with a small bathroom built off the back. A trapdoor led to a root cellar. A narrow ladder went up to the loft where the bed was. It smelled like pine and old smoke. The windows were small but clean. Everything seemed solid and well-built, not the kind of place that creaked or groaned, just very still. That first night, I slept like a rock. No streetlights, no noise, just total blackness and the sound of wind in the trees. I woke up once and couldn't tell if it was 2 a.m. or 6 a.m. The clock had no backlight. I laid there and listened. Nothing. Then I fell back asleep. The next couple days were perfect. I made coffee in the mornings, read outside on the porch wrapped in a blanket, hiked around the area a bit. I didn't see anyone, not a single car or sign of human life. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I didn't even bring my phone outside with me. I was finally relaxing. But on the third night, I woke up around 3 in the morning. It wasn't a dream or a sound that woke me. I just opened my eyes and felt off. It was dark and quiet like before, but there was a strange stillness to it now. I sat up slowly in bed, listening. My ears rang from the silence. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. I climbed down the ladder quietly, trying not to make any noise. I went to the window and looked out. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. I didn't see anything, but that feeling wouldn't go away. I checked the door. Locked. I checked the back window. Nothing. Then I noticed something odd. The firewood I had stacked neatly by the side wall earlier that day looked slightly disturbed. Just one piece was leaning a different way. I didn't remember it being like that. It wasn't much, but it caught my eye. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon. I tried to shake it off and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept opening my eyes and staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next day, I went outside and checked the area more closely. I found faint tracks in the soft dirt near the woodshed. They were too big to be raccoon or fox. Maybe a deer, but they didn't look like hooves. They looked like boots, but faded. Almost as if someone had walked there days ago. The ground was dry though, so it was hard to tell. I kept staring at them, wondering if I had made them myself, but I didn't remember walking over there in the dark. And they weren't in the path I usually took to the outhouse. That day I couldn't relax. I kept glancing out the windows. I listened harder. I stayed close to the cabin. I started carrying the rifle with me even inside. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone else was out there watching me. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Every little creak of the roof expanding or tree groaning in the wind made my stomach turn. At one point, I thought I heard something shuffle outside, near the porch. I held my breath and didn't move. Then it was gone. The next morning, I saw it. A single boot print in the soft dirt just in front of the cabin. A full human boot print, not mine. Too narrow and long. Definitely not mine. It was fresh. I stared at it for a long time. I walked around the cabin in a wide circle, checking for more. I found 3 more prints near the trees, leading away. But they were spaced wide apart, like someone had been moving quickly. I followed them for a bit, but they vanished once the ground got firmer under the trees. I stood out there in the silence, holding the rifle, heart pounding. I kept looking around, waiting to see someone standing behind a tree, but there was no one. I thought about leaving that day. I even packed a bag and loaded it into the truck. But the tank was only half full, and I didn't like the idea of getting stuck in the woods after dark. The sun was already low, and the drive back was long. I told myself maybe it was a hunter who got lost. Maybe they saw the cabin and came close before realizing someone was here. That could happen, right? I forced myself to stay one more night. I double-checked the locks. I closed the shutters on the windows. I kept the rifle within reach at all times. I didn't start a fire so the cabin wouldn't glow from the outside. I laid in bed with my eyes open, listening to every sound. Just before midnight, I heard something. A slow, careful step on the front porch. Then silence. I held my breath, not moving. Then another step. Wood creaked softly under weight. Then nothing again. I got up slowly and crept to the loft edge. The moonlight made the room faintly glow, just enough to see. I stared at the door. The handle moved slightly. Not enough to open it, just a slow jiggle like someone testing it. Then it stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour. I didn't hear anything else. No more footsteps, No retreating movement, no sounds in the woods, just silence. I eventually climbed back into bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I saw the prints again, clearer this time right on the porch. Two different kinds. One set smaller and narrower, a second set wider and more worn. Two people. They hadn't knocked, hadn't tried to break in, just came up to the door and left. That was it for me. I packed up everything. I didn't eat, didn't clean up, didn't leave a note. I just got in the truck and drove. I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire way, expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. When I finally got back into town and got cell service, I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the local sheriff, but what could I say? Strangers walked near my cabin? There was no crime, nothing stolen. But I knew what I felt. They were watching me. They were waiting. Later that week, I checked the listing again. It was gone, completely removed. Not even in the rental history. I searched for the owner's name. No record. I looked on forums for off-grid cabin rentals and found a thread where someone described the same cabin. They had been there the year before. Same thing. Footsteps, prints, someone on the porch in the night. They left early too. I never found out who those people were or what they wanted. I don't know if they were squatters, escaped convicts, or just sick people playing some kind of game. But I know they weren't just passing through. They knew I was there. They came back more than once. They never broke in. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. It was enough to make me never go back into the woods alone again. I still love nature, and I still need quiet sometimes. But now I make sure I can lock the doors, get a cell signal, and call for help if I need it. That cabin was supposed to be an escape from stress. Instead, it showed me something worse than noise and crowds. It showed me how truly alone you can be when the wrong people know where you are.